Bridgehead. Invasion Earth Book 2. By Chris Lowry. Chapter 1. Jake stared through the opening in the plasterboard trying to peek over Danish and Waldo as they stood guard over the entrance. "What the hell are they doing in there?" he grumbled. "Searching," Steph answered. She watched the two soldiers at the entrance, curious but patient. The noise of the crowd stirring around them grew louder, voices murmuring questions and queries, words she couldn't make out. "You opened it," Jake complained. "You should have gone in." "Then I'd be in there, and you'd be out here all alone," she said in a matter-of-fact voice. The noise grew louder, and now Jake could hear yelling and sharp screams from the far corner of the corridor that stretched from the roll-up doors where they entered the entire length of the building, and around the edges. The 15-foot space was packed with people, survivors of the alien invasion who took refuge in the building, even though they couldn't access the enclosed space inside. Until Steph showed up and sawed a hole in the wall. A watery-eyed man hustled up to Waldo. "I need to speak to your leader," he said in a panicked whisper. "Take me to your leader?" Crockett shifted his weapon in his grip. "Isn't that what the Lick said? When the Lick touched down on planet Earth 3 years ago, the first encounter was destroying a convocation of world leaders. The second encounter was killing all of their replacements." "We have a problem," Burmage stammered. The sagging skin on his neck and jowls shook as he moved his head back and forth, peering over his shoulders and then at the noise growing ever louder from the far end of the building. "Lieutenant," Waldo shouted over his shoulder. "What?" a voice screamed from inside the room. "Trouble." Lieutenant William Bonney marched through the knife-cut opening in the wall and stared at the murmuring crowd. "Them?" he grunted. "Him," Waldo pointed to Burmage. The first man to meet them when they broke into the warehouse blinked up at Lieutenant and wrung his hands. "We don't normally open any doors during daylight," he explained. "Because it attracts attention." "What kind of attention?" Lieutenant snapped. "Licks?" Burmage licked his lips, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Rivals," he squeaked. "Bandits." "Banditos?" Lieutenant crowed. He slapped Waldo on the back. "We haven't had a run-in with bandits in, how long, Waldo? 6 months?" "About that, sir." "See," Lieutenant rounded on Burmage. "I hate me some Licks, but there's 2 things I hate worse. Traitors who work with the Licks and sell out their fellow survivors, and damn bullies calling themselves bandits. They don't want to work for it, they just want to take what other folks have worked hard for. It is undamn American, and we ain't going to stand for it. Are we, Crockett?" "No, Lieutenant." "Waldo, get in there and tell Babe to get suited up. Send Doc out here. You," he pointed at Jake. "Follow me." He started down the corridor toward the small metal doorway embedded in one wall. "Girl," Lieutenant called out. "Tell him which way we went." "The name is Steph," she shouted. Lieutenant drew up short. "Where the hell are my manners?" he scoffed at Jake. "Listen, Steph, I'm offering you my sincere apology for forgetting my manners. If my mama was still alive, she'd send me out in the woods to get a switch for that lapse. I've got your name, and I ain't gonna forget it. And if I do, you have permission to call me on it. Name's a powerful thing." "Thank you," said Steph. "But your name ain't Steph, not to me." "I'm pretty sure it's Steph," she said. "Short for Stephanie." "Well and good," said Lieutenant, "but now ain't the time for debate nor is it time for a naming ceremony. Can you shoot Annie Oakley?" "Don't call me Annie," she begged. "All right, Oakley, do what I said and tell the fucking doc to find me." He turned his back on the girl and began walking. Jake fell in step behind him. "Where are we going?" "The man said there was trouble. Weren't you listening?" "Yeah," Jake sulked. "Bandits." "Bandits," Lieutenant agreed. "We're gonna go see what they want. Bandits always want something." Chapter 2. Lieutenant peeked around the corner of the door. "Where?" he asked Burmage. The stout man pointed to the edge of the fence. Lieutenant squinted and glared at the shadows, as if willing the men to appear. Then by magic he could see them. "Not magic, really," he sniffed. "Bumps, and not the kind that go in the night. Fuckers got ghillie suits." He heard Burmage make a noise of agreement behind him. Lieutenant watched the ground move. It slithered and rolled, slow and steady in a relentless onslaught, toward his speed, toward the warehouse. "What do you have that they want?" Bonnie turned his head enough to watch Burmage and still keep the bandits' advance in his peripheral vision. "They take everything," the man whispered almost like a sob. "Food. Shelter. Anything we find, they take." "They know about the inside?" He got a head shake for an answer. No one knew, he said. No one remembered. I mean, I knew the lab was there, but inside? No. We only dreamed of getting in. If you can't find a door, make one, Lieutenant said and shifted back into the shadows. I wish we had a damn radio. How fast can you run? Depends on what's chasing me, Jake cocked up an eyebrow. Which do you think is faster? A bullet or my boot up your ass? What size shoe do you wear? Hey Burmage, those bandits all around, or they pretty much stick to one point of entry? Just the one spot in the fence they cut. They know you're watching? Burmage nodded. It seems to give them a thrill. Why don't you just shoot them? Jake huffed. We don't have guns. I meant him, he pointed to Lieutenant S. I aim to see what they want first. I don't have anything against a shoot-first policy as a standard, but I reserve that for licks. People, they get a little rope to hang themselves with. People work with licks, you know, Jake muttered under his breath. Brother, I know it. And I don't like it any more than you do by the sound of your voice. But let's play it my way till I say otherwise. Yes sir. That's the spirit. Now run your ass out of one of those roll-up doors and go tell Cheryl to wait for my signal. Wait for what? He knows what. Jake leaned over and peeked out of the door. That's a lot of ground to cover with them out there. Yeah, it is. What if they shoot me? Run fast. Faster than a speeding bullet? My boot or a locomotive are your only other options, Lieutenant said. Jake sighed, then pushed off of his knees to stand up, his face lost in the shadows. What's the message? Lieutenant asked him. Wait for my signal. Not your signal, my signal. That's what I meant. But it's not what you said. Now go. Lieutenant rolled down onto his stomach and stuck the barrel of his rifle against the edge of the door. He was still hidden in the darkness inside, but if the banditos crawling toward the warehouse made a move to shoot Jake as he ran, it was a clear shot. Lieutenant listened to the boy shuffle off, and heard the creak of the rolling door as it inched up 1.5 feet. Then pounding footsteps echoed through the cracked asphalt surrounding the complex. The bumps outside paused, waited, but no one popped up to shoot. When the footsteps died down, they resumed their relentless crawl. Hold up, Lieutenant yelled out to them and watched the bumps freeze again. You all think you're being sneaky-like, but we've been watching you for a while now. Why don't you take off them ghillie suits and let's have us a palaver? What's a ghillie suit? Steph asked from the shadows behind him. One of the bumps moved, like the leaf-covered earth surging up, and settled on its knees. It was shaped like a man, vague and indistinct. Lieutenant thought it looked like a lump of moss-covered leaves on a stump he had once seen on a trek through the woods. That's a ghillie suit, he said to her. Camo. He could hear her breath as she settled next to him on the ground, on the inside of the door so she couldn't be seen. We have you surrounded. The moss man yelled. You sure about that? Lieutenant yelled back. I count a dozen ghillies moving up on me, but don't see nothing out by the fence. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? The man called back. Moss man, I think you think that's how it's supposed to work. You know something I don't? The suited man rested a rifle against his shoulder, aimed into the darkness of the doorway. Lieutenant counted 6 more barrels disguised to look like sticks drift toward the same opening. Cousin, he called out. I know a lot of something you don't. The man laughed. I don't have any cousins left, he shouted. Lost them in the first wave. You must be new around here. How you figure? Because the people in there know the score. They know how this is supposed to work. You being new, and me being in a forgiving mood, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Hot damn, cousin. That's awful nice of you to be so giving like that. And I appreciate it. Now let me return the favor. We got ourselves some high-tech going on inside of here, and there's room on the team for you. Team Go Humans is now hiring. So, you want a job, lay down your weapons and line up for an interview? What kind of high-tech? Mossman said. Lieutenant didn't like the greedy sound of his voice. They're going to take it, Burmage muttered behind him. We're outnumbered. He got more than a dozen? 30, said Burmage. Maybe 50. Go check on Babe, see if he's got that suit working yet. Steph scrambled back from him. He listened to her scamper away and turned back to the opening. Look here cuz, I don't like this talking to a man with his face covered crap. I'm going to sit up here in this doorway, and you take off your hat, and let's have a man-to-man on what's happening next. Agreed, said Mossman. He lifted up a grungy hand and swiped the net-covered headdress off. Lieutenant held out his rifle in one hand so they could see it. "But look, don't you go taking potshots at me," he called out and settled with his back against the frame of the door. "This is just friendly discussions, all right." He watched Mossman's hand wave the others down, but he barrels didn't move. Lieutenant sat with his spine against the frame of the door, his body half in the light, rifle on his lap. He made sure the bandits could see both of his hands. "What is going to happen next," Mossman said, "is, you throw out your weapons, and we're coming in to get what's owed to us." "That the way you want this to go down?" Lieutenant asked. "Like I said, you're new here. We have an arrangement." "I am new here," Lieutenant said. "So I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I made a fair offer of employment, and you could still do me some good. But not one of you has laid down your weapon yet. That ain't the way to build up trust." "What's your offer?" Mossman asked. "Now your mind is on the right track, 'cause I'm in the lick-killing business and I'm looking to franchise my operation. You take your merry band of Robin Hoods there, and get to killing what needs killing the most. Fucking licks. Then you leave these nice people alone to do what they need to be doing. Surviving. What makes you think we're not killing the lick already? Brother, you're sitting here talking to me, ain't you? After sneaking up and breaking in. 2 + 2 don't equal 5, no matter how you slice it." Mossman grunted. He shifted his head to the right. Lieutenant watched him make eye contact with the unmoving lump there, heard the mutter of their voices. He didn't like Mossman's pinched face. The grit and grime of the unwashed look, stringy hair framing skull-like cheekbones. The man looked squirrely to him. "Let us in," Mossman finished muttering to the other bump and turned back to Lieutenant. "We're gonna take what's owed to us and anything else we see fit, and if we decide to go hunt aliens after, that's up to us." Lieutenant shook his head. "'Cause, I'm really sorry to hear you say that." Two more bumps sat up, stick-like rifles zeroed in on Lieutenant where he sat. "Not as sorry as you're going to be. You don't want to know about the high-tech we found in here? I'm going to find out." "It's dangerous," Lieutenant shook his head. "Invisible weapons." He held up his finger like a gun, long index finger aimed at one of the bumps. He cocked his thumb back, flicked it down and winked at Mossman. Phew. The bump's head popped, spraying Mossman in goo. The sound of the shot reached them a half-second later. Lieutenant moved his finger again. Phew. A second man's head cracked forward. His body pitched across one of the men still on the ground. Mossman started screaming, to fire, to shoot, to retreat. In the confusion and chaos, Lieutenant lifted his rifle and sent 2 3-round bursts across the tops of the men. Cheryl, from his position at the top of the rows, popped 4 more as they scrambled in different directions. Lieutenant slid his legs out of the door and dropped to the side of the concrete steps. Mossman got 2 of the bandits turned around, laying suppressing fire into the woods behind them, aiming into the treetops. The rest of the uninjured sent a wave of bullets pinging off the concrete. Lieutenant was ducked behind. A buzzing side winged in from another direction. Lieutenant dropped as he saw more bandits scurrying toward his position, and even more beyond the fence, making an angle on the trees where Cheryl and Jake were hidden. "Shit," he muttered and flicked over to single-shot selector. He lined up the sights, aimed at the point man, and sent a round through his throat. The rest froze and stared at him in fear. They stood up straight, ghillie suits dangling from thin limbs, and dropped their weapons. Lieutenant peeked over the steps to see Mossman and the rest doing the same, even the men hundreds of meters away as they stared at his hiding spot. He stood up and kept his rifle trained on them, dancing the sights from man to man. It was nice to be respected, even better to be feared, he thought. A shadow fell across his field of vision and he whipped around, startled. Babe towered on the concrete steps in the suit of armor. A blaster rested across his forearm, aimed at the bandits on the asphalt. His face was hidden behind a reflective faceplate, the matte black suit giving him an alien appearance. "Damn, Babe," Lieutenant whistled. "You look like a real badass." "I didn't before?" The helmet gave his voice a robotic metallic ring. "No." Lieutenant mounted the steps to stand behind him, putting an extra layer of protection between him and the bandits just in case they decided to start shooting. "You looked pretty badass before," Lieutenant said. The bat was the clincher. Pulled together the whole ensemble. But this is a whole new level of badassery. Chapter 3. Lieutenant left Babe to supervise the prisoner taking and returned to the hole in the wall. Steph leaned against the plaster next to Danish. "What are you going to do with them?" Burmage licked his lips as he shuffled behind Lieutenant. "I ain't going to do nothing with them. What are you going to do with them is the question." That seemed to send Burmage into a small fit of hysterics. Lieutenant ignored his mutterings and studied the people in the corridor around him. They looked defeated, beaten, half-starved. "Oakley," he pointed at Steph. "Get out there, find Chief and Cheryl and the three of you bring back some rabbit or squirrel. Hunt up as much as you can find in the next 2 hours." She quirked up an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Doc," Lieutenant yelled through the opening. Doc appeared further inside the room, a headband holding a magnifying eyepiece strapped to his forehead, a soldering iron smoldering in his hand. "You got Babe suited up? You ready for the next one?" Doc nodded. "Get in there, Danish." Lieutenant assumed his post guarding the door as the young man hustled inside the hole. "Crockett, get a fire going in here or out there. Hustle up some roots for the stew." "You okay to pull guard duty alone, Lieutenant?" Lieutenant just squinted, answer enough. Crockett double-timed for the opening before Lieutenant could say anything else. Behind him, he could hear Doc instructing Danish on how to don the armor. There was an order to it. He planned to learn firsthand soon enough. "What's the plan, Lieutenant?" Waldo leaned against the other side of the opening. "Food, Waldo. I meant after we eat." "We ain't eating. Not yet. We're going to feed these folks." Waldo cleared his throat. "That's a lot of people, Lieutenant. An army moves on its stomach. Can we afford to give it away?" Lieutenant studied the crowd, noting the boat heads, the quiet desperation that hung like a miasma in the air. "I like killing licks, Waldo. Let me tell you, it gives me a good feeling, like doing an honest day's work. But if all these folks die, what's the fucking point to it? It's like a yin and yang thing, a balance. We found us a gift today, and good Lord willing, I plan on us putting it to some good use. But I want to give a little hope too. Hard for a man to feel hope when his belly is grumbling. Harder still when he's looking into his little kid's eyes, and can hear their belly grumbling. That makes sense to you?" "I think it's almost poetic, Lieutenant." "Don't break out your fucking handkerchief yet," Lieutenant snickered. "These folks still might die. Just not tonight, not on my watch." Burmage hustled out of the dark end of the corridor and waited until Lieutenant acknowledged him. "Your man has gathered the prisoners," he said when Lieutenant locked eyes with his. "Those weapons are yours," Lieutenant said. "Ask around and find folks who know how to use them." Burmage nodded and scurried away. Danish ghosted up behind them, his foot skittering on the plaster dust, the only sound of his arrival. "Your turn," Lieutenant nodded Waldo through. "What do you think?" Danish flexed the fingers in the gloves, bent into a squat and back up again. "It's like a second skin," Lieutenant could hear his grin through the helmet. He stared at his own skull-like face reflected in the faceplate. All-day hikes under a 60-pound ruck had burned every last vestige of fat off his body. His skin was stretched taut over razor-sharp cheekbones. His eyes looked sunken, and dark under a pronounced brow. The faint reflection made it look like a ghost was staring back at him through the helmet, and Lieutenant bit back a shiver. "Doc," he shouted. The man in the monocle popped up again in the lab. "Once you get Waldo suited up, we need to have us a meeting." Doc nodded and went back to working on the suit, a man in his element. "Stand guard," he told Danish and went back up front to see to the prisoners. Chapter 4. Jake and Steph marched back through the fence with almost 24 squirrels. Lieutenant motioned them toward the trench fire Crockett had built. There was a small debate on just roasting the meat on a spit as opposed to a stew. "Stew goes further," Lieutenant ended the debate. "Besides, these folks ain't had a lot to put in their bellies, they'll sick it up. Keep the stew thin, and they can thicken it up later." As Crockett cleaned and dressed the meat, chopping it into small bits and dropping it into several large pots nested in the embers, Lieutenant gathered his squad around him. Babe, Waldo and Danish stood to one side in their new suits of armor. Oakley and Jake bracketed Crockett as he cooked. Doc was the last one to join them, pulling the headpiece off and holding it in his hands. "All right," Lieutenant said. "Crockett's going to put that stew on to cook, and then suit up. Doc, why don't you tell me a little more about these things? They're more than just body armor, I take it?" Doc cleared his throat. "These are just first-generation prototypes," he said. "Some of the enhancements we added later are lost on Mars or in destroyed bases around the globe. I ain't too worried about what I don't got, Doc, just want to know what I do." "Bio-enhanced feedback," he said. "Strength, endurance, stamina. Think of everything you can do, and multiply it by a factor of 10. That's the nanotechnology." He pointed to Babe's helmet. "Reticular targeting with plutonium-charged plasma blasters." "Like they took to Mars?" said Waldo. "Space guns. Cool." Plasma, said Doc. Hot. We got us some grade A weapons then, said Lieutenant. What else? The first gen were bulletproof, said Doc. But not alien-proof. Their weapons proved to be more difficult to predict. What do you mean? They operate on different light frequencies. That's just how they look, said Lieutenant. And how they interact with our atmosphere, Doc explained. The light has a heat value associated with it, and combined with the alien construction. He shrugged. We haven't been able to stop them from piercing the armor. Got that, boys, Lieutenant shouted. Don't get shot. Not by aliens, Doc added. The first gen is like a small wearable tank. That would be a good analogy. A tank is big and blocky, said Waldo as he aimed a sidekick at Babe's head, stopping inches from the visor in a demonstration of perfect control. He stood, balanced on one foot, the other extended full and held it. This is not big or blocky. I called it a second skin, said Danish. That's what it feels like, Lieutenant, Babe said. You'll see. I will see, Lieutenant answered. Now we know what it can do, let's figure out on what needs doing. We're going to save Lutz, said Babe as if it were obvious. Yeah, that's on my agenda. No sir, Lieutenant, that is the agenda. Lieutenant squinted at Babe but gave him a pass for a moment. The agenda is fluid, Babe. Babe stared into the squinting eyes for a moment, then bowed his visor. High Command sent us on a mission to form a coalition. They don't know about these suits. I haven't decided if I'm going to tell them yet. He ticked off 2 fingers. So far as I see it, we got 2 items on the docket. Organize the resistance. Save Lutz. And whoever else we can free. What about us? Jake asked. What about you? Doc earned his keep, as far as I'm concerned. You and Oakley are still open for debate. We've worked with you, said Steph. Worked with, yeah, Lieutenant shot back. Still ain't 100% where you stand yet. Jake nodded. Steph looked like she was about to say something, but caught the nod out of the corner of her eye and sighed instead. Lutz, Babe reminded them. If we use these to go get Lutz, we'd kill 2 birds with 1 giant rock. I ain't said no, Babe. I'm saying wait. Doc, you got 6 suits? How many on the workbench? 2, and 1 in cold storage. Both require a lot of work. You got what you need here? I think I have most of it, he said. The facilities remained intact. There are ongoing issues of power supply and management, plus computing issues that have yet to crop up. You've got computers in there? Steph gasped. I haven't seen a working computer in, well, ever. 3 years, said Waldo. Aliens popped an EMP in the atmosphere and took out everything. Lieutenant pursed his lips. How did those survive, Doc? Doc rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. Technically, we don't know if it was an EMP. Knocked our asses back into the dark ages though, said Waldo. No computers, no cars, no tech. It had aspects of an EMP, but it seemed selective. For instance, some bases where the aliens have established headquarters maintain utilities that work, in service to their occupation. Inside the wire, they have something we don't, said Lieutenant, but out here, Waldo's right. We're in the Stone Age. But this is about to jump us right up to the Space Age. And no matter what fucking age you are, it's clobbering time. Crockett's going to stay here with you, Doc. Get those other suits up and running. The rest of us are going to reconnoiter where they're holding Lutz. He locked eyes with Babe. To see what we're up against, and make contact with a couple of outposts to coordinate. He held up 3 fingers. 3 birds. Big fucking stone. Chapter 5. Lieutenant didn't like leaving Crockett behind to guard the dock. But with Cheryl trailing them by a couple 100 meters, rifle at the ready, he felt a little better at their prospects. Leroy dead. Rook dead. Suds wounded and Lutz pow. He was down half his squad and damn it, he did not like it one bit. Even the addition of Jake and Oakley didn't sit well with him yet. They were both gung-ho to help, even the boy despite his grumbling and smart-ass mouth. But eager to please didn't buy much stock in his book, not when their origins were so suspect. He flexed in the suit as they walked. It did indeed fit like a second skin, the material felt thin, but he could also feel the strength in it. Doc didn't tell him about the needles that inserted into an artery in his leg, and a vein in his arms. He felt the pinprick as he slid into the suit and settled into the contours of the fabric. What the fuck was that? The nano, Doc answered as he adjusted the helmet. Nano? It's injected into your bloodstream, said Doc. Lieutenant almost shot him. He considered it, and his hand moved of its own accord before he stopped short of drawing his weapon. "You forgot to mention that part, Doc." "Did I? I must have been overcome in the excitement," he said. "I apologize for the oversight." Oversight. That's what the Peggy called failing to tell him that tiny machines would be whirring around inside his bloodstream, connecting him to the techie war. But he had to admit, it felt damn good. The nanotechnology was working on tiny injuries, Doc told him. Micro tears in the muscle fibers, cellular reconstruction. Lieutenant could envision 1,000,000,000,000 tiny robots reconstructing him from the inside. He felt stronger. He felt refreshed. It was an addictive feeling, and it made him wonder a few things. Like if the technology was limited to just the suits, or if they could create injectables to help the population. That was grand scope thinking, and he had always been a man who admired big hairy goals. But he didn't want to lose sight of the mission. First things first, he told himself. "What's first?" asked Oakley. She was suited up next to him, but carried an M16 rifle instead of a plasma gun. He had it strapped to his back, Babe had Jake's strapped to his. Lieutenant relented and put them in the tech after the stew was done, and he wasn't thinking about being hungry. The truth was, he had been haunted by the vision of his own skull staring back at him through a helmet. The rational side of him knew it was just a reflection, but a small bone of superstition made the idea stick, and he wasn't sure what it meant. The people in the warehouse ate. They expressed their thanks and gratitude by killing the bandits with their own weapons. Lieutenant wondered if they would show mercy, or if the banditos would have reciprocated if the gun was in the other hand. But the refugees were fed up, and angry. Killing the men who took so much from them returned a small measure of control to their lives. That and food ignited a spark of hope, just as he predicted. "Patrol," Babe froze and hissed a whisper. Lieutenant watched the others duck beside and behind the trees. He chided himself for foregoing the ghillie suits and worked his way up to Babe. They were on a small rise overlooking a 2-lane blacktop that rounded a curve on the left, and ran in a long straight line until he could no longer see it in the distance. The patrol hovercraft meandered from the horizon, aimed at the curve. "Path of least resistance," Lieutenant observed. "Sir?" "Shortest distance between 2 points, Babe." He couldn't see his face, not behind the visor that reflected his own mirrored visage. But he used his imagination to watch the wheels turning in Babe's head as he put it together. "Straight line." Lieutenant motioned Danish and Waldo further up the road, settled Jake with Babe behind the tree and took Oakley with him. "On my mark," he ordered them. They hunkered down to wait. It didn't take long for the hovercraft to pass them. Lieutenant let it get 10 meters beyond his position, almost even with Babe, then opened fire. He aimed for the engine compartment, a bulge on the fuselage that powered the craft. The laser blaster ripped through the alloy and sent it crashing into the asphalt. It skittered along as his squad opened fire, peppering the canopy and body of the ship with smoking craters. The top ejected with a powerful explosion that rocked them back, even in their suits, and 4 lick soldiers spilled out, weapons blazing. Jake and Steph opened up with the conventional weapons, smashing snouts, cracking scaly skin. Babe drew a target on one of the soldiers and almost fired as his head exploded. Cheryl up in a tree had locked in on their position. The shooting was over in seconds. "Lieutenant!" Waldo screamed. Lieutenant jumped up and raced toward the forward position. His movement was effortless, almost balletic due to the suit and the robots floating in his bloodstream. He could hear the amplified footsteps of the rest of his squad racing after him. Waldo knelt beside Danish on the ground. A smoking crater occupied where his stomach should have been. "I told him to stay down," Waldo explained. Lieutenant dropped beside them and worked the helmet off Danish's head. He took off his own and set it down next to his knee. "How did I do, Lieutenant?" Danish coughed through a mist of blood. Lieutenant wiped the crimson stain off the boy's lips. "You did fine, Danish. Real fine. You were a Jedi Knight of badass lip killing. Some of the best I ever seen, I shit you not." "Really?" Danish gasped and took a long rattling breath. "What's a Jedi Knight?" His eyes glazed over as he stared into the abyss, the life sneaking out of him in a long slow wheeze. Lieutenant wiped the back of his hand across his nose and sniffed. "We know," said Steph, her voice thick with emotion, eyes swimming in unshed tears. "He ain't ever heard of a Jedi," Lieutenant moaned. "Fucking licks. What kind of fucking world do we have if you don't know who the fucking Jedis are?" "I don't know," she sighed. "I think it was rhetorical," said Babe. "No," said Steph, "I don't know what a Jedi thing is either. Were they like seals?" Lieutenant snickered through his clogged nose as he stood. Something like that, he told her. What do we do with him? Babe sniffled through tears. We got to hide him, babe. We need that suit. It's shot up, sir. Won't do any good now. Yeah, maybe, said Lieutenant. He took a moment to compose himself over the body of his dead soldier, and bowed his head. You praying? Jake asked. Something like that. You still believe in God? Don't matter what I believe, not anymore. Only matters is what he believed. He wanted to live in a world where it was possible. So, I said a little prayer to God, or to the gods of war, or Odin, I really don't give a fuck, which one, so long as they make his transition a little easier. Fucking licks. Kid didn't deserve to get shot, didn't need to die out here in the middle of the fucking woods. He was trying to do something good, said Steph. You think this is fucking good? Lieutenant snapped. One more kid gone. One more human slaughtered. How many of us got to die to save one man? All of us, Lieutenant, said Babe. Lots would do it for you. You think so, Babe? I think you guys would let me go on doing what I do inside, and you get to doing what we did out here. How many patrols have gone unmolested since we started trying to round up a coalition? How many licks get to go on breathing while Danish is dead, Rook 2? Suds out for the count. Lutz captured. And the lick still out there. His voice came in a low fast growl, rage burning in his ice blue eyes. You want to tell me it's worth it? You want to tell me it's okay to trade his life for someone else's? How about yours? Who can I trade you for, Babe? Lieutenant. Don't say nothing. Lieutenant held up a hand to forestall his comment. You think I'm losing it, 'cause I can see it in your eyes. You think this dead kid here is the straw that broke the fucking camel's back. I ain't no damn camel, Babe. And he sure as fuck ain't straw. I'm just sick of this alien bullshit. We kill 'em 10 at a time, maybe less, maybe more. And all the fucking while, they're still here, still got more of 'em. We need something bigger. Something bolder. We need to destroy their mothership. Lieutenant glared at Jake. Say that again. Jake ran a gloved hand across the chest plate of his suit. We have these, but you're right. What are you doing with them? Makes harassing the patrols easier? Jake waved a hand at Danish on the ground. But they're supposed to keep us safe. Destroy the mothership, Lieutenant said, almost to himself. He cradled his blaster. Babe, Steph, I want that suit off Danish. Divide it up and rock it out. You, he pointed to Jake. Dig a grave for his body. We ain't gonna leave him out here for the critters to get. Babe and Steph kneeled over the body and began to strip it. They packed it away piece by piece into their backpacks, stealing Danish's own for even more space. Lieutenant wandered to the edge of the road and glared at the still-burning hulk of the Lick hovercraft. His eyes studied the smooth lines and shallow curves of the construction. The polymer metal was dented, crumpled, electrical fires melting the shape in spots. He sniffed the acrid stench of burning plastic, the computer brain being fried. The Lick could bury their own dead, he thought. If they even bothered to come retrieve them. Then he knew how he was going to get onto the Lick base and rescue Lutz. It came to him in a moment of clarity as he leaned a shoulder against the tree and watched the aftermath of carnage stretched out in front of him. Babe. He called out. Lieutenant? The man said from several meters behind him. Lieutenant looked over his shoulder and saw his second waiting, balancing under a double load of suit and his own gear. I had me an idea, Babe. You ready to move up to the majors? I'm not even a captain yet, Lieutenant. Lieutenant snorted. Minor league to major league, he explained. Baseball. I don't remember, said Babe. You don't have to remember, Lieutenant told him. I'll remember enough for the both of us. He led him back through the woods to the others so they could outline the plan. Chapter 6. The group marched in stoic silence, the loss of Danish weighing on them. Steph drifted closer to Lieutenant. Why did you call him Danish? She asked. You call me Annie Oakley, Jake Chief. I don't know the others' real names. Her soft voice carried through the silence of the woods, only the insects humming to betray their presence. Lieutenant tilted his head so he could see the reflection of his helmet in her visor. I wanted a fucking donut, he said. Told the boys to keep a lookout if we were scavenging. You find any donuts in a bag, bring 'em to me straight away. We run up an old gas station convenience store. Thing's a burned out shell, roof half caved in. Lick must have sent a round through the wall or something. But you never know what kind of treasure might be inside, if a place like that's been overlooked. That little fucker comes running out waving something in his hands, screaming he had a donut for me. Turned out, it was a cheese Danish. Danish, Steph breathed. Danish, agreed Lieutenant. How did it taste? Plastic melted to it from the heat. Couldn't eat it. She nodded, and as they kept walking, she fell back in step with Jake. We got any intel on this place? Babe asked. Yeah, said Lieutenant. See that mountain? It's 10 clicks from here. That's where we're going. They built a compound on a mountain? That's stupid, said Waldo. Lick ain't found him yet. That's what we thought about the last place. Lieutenant agreed with him, but kept it to himself. He had thought they were secure in the last compound they visited, but a Lick convoy showed up while they were there and bombed the place to hell. They used a special kind of concussive weapon that knocked people out. Humans were taken captive, including one of his own men, Lutz. The suits made the 20 kilometers float by. Lieutenant couldn't remember feeling so good, so strong and rested, his entire life. It was like the nano inside of him gave the boundless energy of a 5-year-old. The woods thinned out as they approached the mountain. He could see signs that the calling was on purpose, trees cut to ground-level stumps. The aging of the wood told him it had been years ago. He stopped on the edge of a bare spot and studied the incline. You see them? Babe asked. He nodded, then realized Babe might have compromised peripheral vision in the helmet. He checked his own as he said out loud. I see 'em. He held up a hand and waved, motioned the four-armed men toward them. Step out so they can see us, hold up your hands. Like a surrender? Waldo snorted. Ain't gonna hurt us if they shoot, said Lieutenant, but minimize our threat level. I think them shooting us would get our parlay off to a bad start. Don't move, one of the men called down to them. Do we look like we're moving? The men approached on opposite vectors so they could create interlocking fields of fire if they began shooting. Lieutenant was at the tip of the V. Who are you? The first man asked as he got closer. What are you? One of his companions asked. We are the answer to your dreams, boys. I dreamed of Jeannie, said the first man. Not some goon in a suit. Who you calling a goon, asshole? Babe muttered. He hefted his stick against his shoulder. Babe, said Lieutenant, let's play nice with our hosts. Babe? You're the Babe? The second man asked. King of the home run derby, Babe answered. Are you the kid? Don't fucking call me the kid, said Bonnie. Go get Holcomb, the first man said to his companion. He'll sort it out. He lowered his rifle as the second man ran back to a black gash in the mountain next to a rock. They watched him slip into the darkness, and that's when Lieutenant noticed. Smoke, he said. It was faint, a hazy smudge against the mountainside, but now that he focused on it, he could tell what it was. Smoke coming from a hole in the ground. Where's your compound? He asked the first man. He got no answer though. The man watched the gash in the rock, eyes moving back and forth from the men in armor to the hole and back again. After a few moments that seemed to stretch like hours, the second man slid out of the darkness, followed by another. Lieutenant watched Holcomb descend the path down the side of the mountain, and calculated the distance based on his size. He must have been a large man once, but his shoulders were slumped now, by age, by command, by the weight of responsibility for keeping this patch of the human race still alive. He turned a thin face toward Lieutenant. You the leader? He asked. Are you? This man says you're Lieutenant William Bonney. Lieutenant lifted up a gloved hand and popped open the visor on his helmet. That's the name my mama gave me, he said. I think my daddy thought it would be a good joke. Bonnie, you're wearing tech suits. We are? No one has seen tech suits in years, said Holcomb, staring at the men as if he didn't believe them. Not since the aliens landed. We're upgrading, said Babe. Holcomb looked at the stick on his shoulder. I thought you carried a bat? Lost it in a fight, said Babe. I'm on the hunt for a new one. Good luck with that. Holcomb crossed his arms over his chest. What brings you to my command? We're recruiting, said Lieutenant. High Command has a message. I hope it's not any of the join up and we'll work together bullshit, cause if it is, you can go sell it somewhere else. Lieutenant eyed the compound leader for a moment, measuring him. Holcomb locked his eyes on the squinty ice blue ones glaring at him and returned it for equal measure. This ain't a sales call, said Lieutenant after a moment. This is a courtesy call. Did High Command send me out here to drum up support? Yeah, they did. But am I going to force you to do anything? Look, you can hide out here on the mountain or you can hear me out. In, said Holcomb. In what? The message? The mountain. We're not on the mountain. We're in the mountain. Lieutenant looked past him to stare at the gash in the rock. He saw it was in the ground next to the rock, a clever use of shadows and depth to alter the appearance. "Nice work," he said. "High Command put you in those suits to get people in line? Pound on the patriotic drum for God and country?" "We found these," said Lieutenant. "Bullshit. The licks destroyed the labs." "They missed one," said Babe. "And if they missed one, there might be others," Lieutenant told him. He watched Holcomb's eyes shift as that bit of news sparked a few thoughts in his head. The compound leader was old enough to remember what the world was like before, if the struggle for day-to-day survival hadn't burned the memories out of him. Lieutenant knew it was all about focus. One of the reasons he was so good at killing licks, he surmised, was his focus on that singular task. He didn't worry about the past because it was dead and gone. He didn't spend too much time on the far future, because it hadn't happened yet. His focus on the now made him a good lick killer. Holcomb reached a decision, and it softened the hard lines in his face. "We're exposed out here," he said. "Let's move inside." He turned around and didn't wait for them to follow as he led them up the path. They fell in step behind him as he led them through the gash in the ground. Inside, it opened up to what looked like a Viking communal hall from a history book. The earth walls stretched as far back as a football field, sanded tree trunks acting as columns to hold up the ceiling. A long rock hearth stretched the length of the room, benches gathered around it, small flames fluttering the length of it. Lieutenant could see torches set in the columns and on sconces in the walls. People moved in the shadows, slipping away from the fire as the squad in tech suits marched in. "You think this tech will lead to more?" "Maybe," said Lieutenant. "It's a possibility. We have a couple of veterans of Mars here who say otherwise." "Ain't possible," said Lieutenant. "Nobody made it out alive." "Nobody's making it off Earth alive either," said a crusty voice from behind the flames of the campfire. Lieutenant tried to make out a face in the shadows, but couldn't until the man leaned forward. He had been beautiful once. The memory of it was there, hidden in the lines, creases and scars that marred the structure of his features. Blue eyes dancing with mirth over a sad knowing smile. "Everybody's going to die," said the man. "Someday." "Not on my watch," Lieutenant said to his squad. "Nobody dies unless I give the order to do it, got it?" "You sound like my old commander," said the man. He shifted up with a slight groan and limped around the fire. His leg had been busted, sometime in the past, set improperly, and it showed. His limp was pronounced, a slight thump and drag echoed in the cabin as he walked. He was all about orders too. "You were on Mars?" Babe couldn't keep the skepticism out of his voice. "We were," a second voice added and stepped into the light. "Now I like me some big tall tales," said Lieutenant. "My mama told me all about Pecos Bill growing up, and the Arkansas Traveler. But two war-torn veterans that happened to be in the same spot and saying the same thing. I have a birthday, boys, but I wasn't born yesterday." The pretty one laughed, his gray blonde hair flopping around his too skinny face. Now a lieutenant could see the second man as he shifted forward into the light. Younger than the other by at least a decade, maybe more. The left side of his face and head burned, scarred. His eyes looked haunted instead of happy. Lieutenant figured the injury would make him so. "We pulled them from the crash," said Holcomb. "They almost didn't make it." 3 years ago," said the older man. "Mars fell, the last outpost overrun. I think the lick were on their way here even then. We stole a ship, one of our cargo transports. I thought he knew how to drive. I told you, I'm a fighter, not a pilot." "Not too good at either, were you?" the laughing man said. They could tell it was a joke with the way they teased each other. "You're the kid?" He turned to Lieutenant. "Don't call me that," said Bonnie. "Lieutenant will do." "Lieutenant," the blue eyes traveled over the suits the squad was wearing. "That's first-gen tech you're wearing." His pink tongue worked the corners of his mouth, as he studied the suits. "The licks destroyed all the labs, we thought." "Yeah, we thought too. Turns out, we got us a doc who survived and he knew where one was." "You have a doctor," said Holcomb. "We have sick he can help." "Ain't that kind of doc," said Lieutenant. "He's a Peggy," Babe added. Weber limped closer, ran his finger along the shoulder and arm of Lieutenant's suit. "The first gen had a bug," he said. "We had to work it out in the field. Your targeting software get glitchy?" The men around Lieutenant nodded. "We just flip up the mask and eyeball it." Weber grinned over his shoulder at Renard. "Why didn't we think of that?" "Explosive decompression." "Oh yeah," Weber still grinning. "Guess that's not so important down here." He circled the squad, his eyes traveling up and down the armor. He stopped beside Waldo and held out his hands. "Can I check your weapon?" Waldo gulped and stared at Lieutenant Bonney, gave a fractional nod, and Waldo passed over his blaster. Weber hefted it in his hands, the grip and barrel nested into his palms like they were custom-fitted. He sighted along the top and moved the weight with practiced ease as he aimed at something outside and beyond the wall, visible in his mind, or the ghost of enemies past. "Can we see the lab?" he asked in a voice Lieutenant couldn't quite place, almost a tremble of fear, as if his request could be denied. But Lieutenant needed to know. If these were real veterans of the Mars invasion, then maybe they could tell him something about fighting the Lick on Earth. And if they knew secrets, or tactics, then maybe he could kill more Licks. His burning desire. The thing that kept him awake at night. How to kill more. How to kill them all. "We have 2 more stops to make." "You can't travel," said Renard. Weber chuckled. "You're not the boss of me," he snickered, and Renard gave him a tired half-smile. Lieutenant realized the muscles on the left side of his face might not work so well anymore. "He's my commander," Renard explained. "Even out of uniform?" Babe asked. "Babe? You ain't gonna do what I say if I don't have a uniform on?" Lieutenant busted him. Babe stuttered and looked around for help. "You're not in uniform right now, Lieutenant. I was just their retirador." "It's alright, Babe," Lieutenant said. "I figure if I say something worth doing, you'll listen." "We're not retired," said Weber. "We were just MIA. Now you found us." Lieutenant watched the 2 older men for a moment, considering the implications of escorting them through the woods. "All right," he told them. "Ruck up. Don't fall behind." He left the 2 men to gather their gear and turned to Holcomb. "High Command's gonna want to know your answer." Holcomb stared at Lieutenant with a blank expression on his tired face. The lines from worry had carved deep canyons in his skin. Mountains of concern turned his shoulders into almost broken slopes. Staring at the suit, Holcomb stood a little straighter. It wasn't much, not an iron rod of certainty, to be sure. "I suppose the time for hiding is over," said Holcomb. "Some of us haven't been hiding at all," said Babe. "We've been taking the fight to them. We couldn't afford the cost." "We don't have money either," Babe snapped back. "He's not talking about money, doofus," Oakley answered. "The cost in lives." Lieutenant nodded as he stared around the compound. The long low hutch was filled with faces, gritty, scared, orange in the flickering hearth fire that stretched through the middle of the communal room. These people had gone to ground, literally. The hutch was half buried in the side of a hill, camouflaged to be hidden from overhead patrols. They had burrowed into the earth to hide from the invaders, intent only on survival. Lieutenant wondered what that had cost them. Not just in terms of manpower and bodies, but in spirit. He wasn't much of a student of history. Hell, school seemed like a long lifetime ago before the Lick even came. But he knew history was peppered with people willing to fight. Willing to revolt against aggressors, willing to stand up for something. Freedom, he called it, though it went by a few names. It was a concept, some would say even a myth. He remembered the government's power over the media before the invasion, the way groups of people could control others with commercials and editorial pieces. Hell, even the news, which was supposed to be unbiased, turned out to have an agenda. All of it was gone now, supplanted by one need: survival. But the Lick wasn't going to let them survive. The Lick wanted them dead, and his home planet all to themselves. Freedom meant not letting that happen. Lieutenant stared into the flames, mesmerized by the way it made shadows dance across the faces of the people staring at him in the suit. Darkness and light, flickering movement. They had spent too long in the darkness. 3 years. Now it was time to show them the light and lead them out in it. Drag them if he had to. It was the only way humanity could survive. Chapter 7. Jake stared at Bernard across a campfire in a clearing. Babe and Waldo stood sentry beyond the meager light cast by the fire as Oakley tended the rabbit on a spit. "You keep staring at me like that and I'll think you fancy me," said Renard. Half of his face looked youthful, smooth lines not yet gone to wrinkle. The other half was healed scars, burned tissue from the top of his cheek and back. It tugged at the corner of his mouth and gave the eye on that side a droopy look, despite the sparkle hidden behind. "You were on Mars?" Jake asked. "I was. They sent prisoners to Mars," said the boy. "That's why we lost." Weber resettled on the ground, his back against a tree as he searched for a comfortable spot. "We've heard that once or twice since we got back," the older man said. "Usually from people who've lost someone. How old are you? 18? Close enough. Weber nodded. That's how old I was when they sent me up, said Renard. Who did you lose? Weber said. The left side of his face didn't move much as he spoke. It looked spooky in the firelight, like he was wearing half a mask. Excuse me? The ones who say it was our fault, the soldiers' fault, they lost someone, Weber explained. His eyes danced in the firelight, like he was in on some inside joke with the cosmos. Sometimes more than one someone? Weber continued. My dad, Jake grunted in answer. My brother. Weber nodded in a wise fashion. Have you heard of the Citadel? Renard barked. Weber tried to wave him off. That's ancient history, he said. Things that matter down here are different. Renard glared into the fire while Weber watched Jake, a curious look on half of his face. Citadel? Lieutenant asked. You heard of it? Weber joked. Studied it, Lieutenant said. You the guy? Wasn't much to study I suppose, said Weber. Unless you think studying luck is a worthwhile endeavor. Wasn't a success, said Lieutenant. Everyone died. Almost everyone, Renard snapped. Almost everyone, Lieutenant agreed. One man made it out. They dropped a shipload of us in a dome, said Weber. His thick fingers worked the kinks out of one hand, as if they ached. It wasn't cold, not yet, so Lieutenant surmised it might ache from memories. Talk about a cluster. One crate of weapons for hundreds of us. One set of instructions. No training. But you survived. I survived. And you did it twice, getting off Mars. Weber nodded. Stole a ship, said Renard. Last ship out, as far as we know. We hit the atmosphere almost at the same time as the Licks exploded the EMP. Shorted out our systems. He used his finger to indicate the network of scars on his head. But any crash you can walk away from. Funny you surviving twice, said Jake. Pretty lucky. I never said I wasn't, kid. You wouldn't want to play poker with me. What's poker? Poker, Babe called out of the darkness. But I hardly know her. Renard and Waldo chuckled. Babe, there's a lady present, said Lieutenant. I've heard worse. Steph turned the rabbits, watching small droplets of grease drip into the flames to create miniature volcanoes in the fire. I had brothers. Had, Weber sighed. So much lost down here. Why didn't you fight? Jake asked. You landed. You had access to weapons, and experience. You could have what? Ever been in a crash, son? Weber answered, but it felt like an evasion. A half-truth. We watched them all die. They hunted us on Mars, and just when we thought we won, it was a trap. We barely made it out. Jake glared at the two veterans, then into the flames. He spit into the fire and listened to it sizzle on a rock. We've watched people die. We've lost people, and we're fighting. Call us cowards, son. I'm not your son, Jake snapped and shoved up off the ground. He stomped toward the darkness at the edge of the campsite and muttered curses into the night. Your man has a discipline problem, Weber told Lieutenant. I like that in a soldier. He's not a soldier, said Lieutenant. I'm not sure what he was before. We conscripted him on a train heist. Him, her in the dock who found the suits. We've heard about your exploits out here, said Renard. A real cowboy operation you've got going. Yeah, I'm pretty darn proud of the work we've done. Miles to go, though. Is it worth it? Renard asked, but he said it in a way that seemed like he didn't expect an answer. It's ready, Steph announced. Lieutenant took a sniff through his open visor. Damn Oakley, you're better at that than Lutz. I may have to change your name to Julia Childs. Her name's not Oakley? Renard asked. He doesn't use our real names, said Steph as she slid half a rabbit into the hands of Weber and watched as he juggled it like a hot potato. We heard that too, said Weber. But the way word travels down here, it's hard to know what's real and what's made up. You're a bit of a legend now. You hear that, Babe? I'm a tall tale around here. Like Paul Bunyan and the Babe. You named him after an ox. Weber tore off the rabbit into small strips and put it into his mouth with the tips of his fingers. Hell no, Babe squatted and accepted half a rabbit from Steph. Named me after a baseball player. Babe Ruth, Weber grinned and licked the grease off his fingers before tearing into some more. Home run and strikeout king. How can you be both? Babe asked. Because he went down swinging, Babe. Jake stomped back to the fire and sat next to Steph. Drawn in by the smell of cooking, said Lieutenant, get some every time. They ate in silence for a few moments, making quick work of the small meal, then tossed the bones into the flames. The smell of roasted meat lingered over the small campsite. "You call them all by nicknames," said Weber as he leaned back and stared through the canopy at the stars beyond. "But you won't let anyone nickname you." "Well, the way I figure, most folks are going to go for the easy play and call me by the moniker you did back at the compound." "Billy the Kid." Lieutenant grimaced and nodded. "A joke my dad made, maybe. Could have been my mother. She had a comedic disposition, and the teasing from other children would have pleased her." "You don't know that it did?" "They passed when I was too young to know better. No other living relatives, so I ended up in an orphanage." "They raided orphanages for alien fodder on Mars," said Renard. "How did you avoid it?" "Clean living," Lieutenant smirked. "Or mayhap some of that luck your sergeant is so fond of." "You know my rank." "Like I said, we did some studying. And I am a student of lick killing." "I'd say you were a master," said Waldo as he stood to return to sentry duty. "Thank you, Waldo, that was kind of you to say in front of our guests. Killing fucking licks is one of the pleasures I get out of a life that ain't had many." "What else do you do besides kill licks?" Renard asked. "What have you heard?" The younger man shrugged. Lieutenant ran some math in his head and calculated his age near the early 20s, but his face had the set of a much older man. He guessed Warren crashes would do that to a man. "I drink beer," said Lieutenant. "Beer doesn't exist anymore," Babe called back to them. "I dream of beer," said Lieutenant, "and when we find it someday, I will drink it." "I know how to make wine," said Steph. "What are you planning to do with that suit?" Weber stared at the lumpy ruck on the ground beside Jake, but his question was directed at Lieutenant. "Wine?" Lieutenant glanced at Steph. "Oakley, if you know how to make wine, then you have the basics for bootlegging moonshine. If we found the ingredients, do you think you could build a still?" She nodded. "I think so. It wouldn't be too hard, if I had help." Lieutenant clapped his hands together. "Think you can skip the pre-drunk celebration and answer his question?" Renard grumbled. "There's no answer yet," said Lieutenant. "I'm still deciding. But I also have one more tool for my lick-killing tool belt coming up." "You're going to give them corn mash?" Lieutenant grinned. "I'm going to give them whiskey by the gallon." Chapter 8. Jake lay back on the ground and stared up at the stars. His leg ached, but he couldn't recall why. He shifted position to try and find more comfort, but the pain was deep, and nothing worked. He rolled over on his side and saw Steph watching him in the low light of the small fire. She offered a tiny smile, and he returned a half grin. "Can't sleep?" she murmured. He shook his head. "You either?" "Not since before I was captured," she said. "You remember it?" It was her turn to shake her head. "Vaguely," she said. "Like the memory of a dream." He grinned again. "I can't even remember that much." "Where did they get you?" "I don't know. I remember being taken," she whispered. "I was at a camp in Colorado. A couple hundred of us. The hovers moved in and zapped us with sound waves. I woke up on one of their bases." "Near here?" He watched one shoulder shift up and down, a half shrug to his answer. "I don't know where here is." "Me too." "Where were you before?" "Small town on the border of Missouri," he said. "I think we're still in the middle. Somewhere." "But you don't know," she said. "It doesn't look like Colorado, but there are mountains, ridges. Could be Tennessee?" "Could be. Could be West Virginia." "Maybe," he said. But he didn't think so. The Ozarks and Appalachians looked different. He couldn't recall why, scratching back in his memory to some boring lecture in school by a teacher whose name he couldn't remember too. Something about climates and zones. Certain trees only lived in certain places. "Like people," he snickered. "What?" "I think we're still near home," he said. "A couple 100 miles. We were going north on the train." "Do you know where?" "I don't remember being put on the train. I remember waking up when it stopped." She sighed. "I don't remember being put on the train either," she said. "Just when they rescued us." Before this happened, the aliens, Jake rolled onto his back and absently massaged his upper leg with his hand. "I used to get a funny feeling if I forgot my homework or left something at home. That's what I feel like now, like I've forgotten something." Steph rolled over too and watched the stars shimmer and shine. "I feel like that too." They stared up together in silence for a few moments. "What do you think it means?" she whispered. "I don't know," he finally said. "I'm not sure if I want to." Chapter 9. Lutz stared at the metal ceiling of the warehouse where the prisoners bunked. Slept might be more accurate, since there were no bunks, but even sleeping was on the verge of impossible in their prison. They worked. That's all he knew. The licks beat them, kicked them, tortured them to do whatever needed to be done on the former base, and then release them into the warehouse when the sun went down. Food was rat, if they could catch it, fried on tiny fires built by some prisoners who snuck twigs, sticks or bits of whatever was flammable in their pockets back to the one giant cell. That's what the warehouse was, one giant cell, he thought. Tin walls, tin roof, blocking out the stars. He had killed 2 rats the first day in. Caught them gnawing on a prisoner who had died in the night. While he looked around for a way to cook them, 6 skeletons jumped him and stole his kill. 6 on 1, he muttered. He remembered watching the bomb fall from the sky, remembered running. Then he woke up here, dumped into an airport hangar to work on a hovercraft. The learning curve was steep. No one would talk to him, even when he tried to whisper a question. He learned why. Another man, a prisoner from the compound where he was taken, balked at a lick soldier. The aliens made an example of him by drawing out the torture so his screams echoed across the camp. Then darkness fell, and he was thrust into a new hell. The warehouse was large, big enough to hold 4 747s wing to wing. It was full of confused people who kept muttering about how they got there. He knew how. He just didn't know why. Why were the Lick taking new prisoners, and how did they know to attack the compound at the same time his squad was raiding it? The ceiling didn't offer any answers. No one did. The concrete under his back was cold, unforgiving. Cold seeped in, leaching his bones of warmth, filling him with a delache. Lieutenant would come. He hoped he would. Unless they thought he was dead. In all of their ambushes, in their attacks on Lick patrols, they had never discussed being taken prisoner. What to do, how to handle it. He heard sobbing in the darkness across the warehouse, someone breaking down into hysterics. Handling it better than them, he muttered. Good for you, a voice said next to him. Soft. Raspy, but a woman's. Or a girl's, hard to tell. It was dark. Could be worse, he said. How? It could be weeks later, he thought, but didn't say it out loud. Weeks later, there would be a lot more dead, from starvation, and beating. Those who still lived would be little more than animals, fighting for scraps of food, for places on the concrete floor. But he didn't say that to the girl with the raspy voice. Could be hot, he said instead. It will be, she told him. As if they would still be around when the seasons flipped and it got hot again. Southern hot, where the air is so thick with humidity, the sun turns it into a muggy clinging mist that offers no relief. The inside of the warehouse would be fetid with the stench of their unwashed bodies, mixed with the dead, and awful. Summer's gonna be bad, he agreed, even though he knew they wouldn't live to see it. Then we need to get out before then, she answered. Lutz sat up and stared into the darkness. He was used to the woods, where starlight created an ambient glow, at least enough to see shadows and shapes. But the darkness in the warehouse was complete, total pitch. He couldn't make out shape, or shadow, just the area where the raspy voice originated. Count me in, he said. But this time, she didn't answer. He heard the scuffling sound of a body moving across the concrete, away from him. Hey! He called after her. Shut up! Someone screamed back. A man. Another on the verge of hysterics. He didn't dare chase her in the dark. Too many people to trip over, too many chances to get hurt. Lutz sat back, put his hands behind his head and stared up at the metal ceiling he couldn't see. He worked on committing her voice to memory, so that when he heard it again, he could mark her. He had an ally. Now he just needed a plan. Chapter 10. What's the plan, Lieutenant? Babe marched up next to Bonnie. You know the plan, Babe. It ain't changed. We're not looking for Lutz, Babe reminded him. That should be the plan. Lieutenant sighed. He too wanted to run off to rescue Lutz. If he was even alive. Do you know how much damage we could do with these suits? Babe flexed an arm out in front of them, curling the gloved fingers into a tight fist. Yeah, said Lieutenant, I've got a damn good idea of what we could do with them. The thing is, Babe, there are a couple of ways this could go down. He glanced at the rest of the squad spaced out in the woods. We're a little short-handed right now. Babe looked around too. I don't see what you're seeing, Lieutenant. There's 7 of us. 6 suits. I know you're itching in your britches to go kill some fucking Licks, But we need to hold up. Take it down a notch. I can't believe what I'm hearing, Lieutenant, Babe swore under his breath, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. I signed up to kill, and you're fucking telling me it's time to back off. What happened to the man who wanted 1,000 fucking heads? Lieutenant glared at Babe and the look sent a shiver down the suited man's spine. He took a step away from Bonnie, held up a hand. Sorry, he said. Lieutenant took a deep breath and let it out through his lips. Apology accepted, he said. Tension's running high and fuck all. You still owe me 1,000 heads, and since Lutz is taking a breather working for the lick, you owe me his heads too. I ain't forgot why we're out here. Then let's suit up the new two, and go get him. Get them, Babe tried one more time. Getting Lutz is a priority. But it ain't priority one. We're gonna get these two vets up to high command, check on Doc to see if he's got those last two suits ready for us, and steal us a hovercraft. Babe stopped and watched Lieutenant's back as he kept walking. Steal a hovercraft. That's what I said, Babe, Bonnie called over his shoulder. We don't know how to fly it. Babe shook his head and trotted after him. I don't know how to fly it. Do you know how to fly it? That hovercraft came up on a straight line, Lieutenant said, pointing through the trees to the black ribbon of asphalt as it wound in and out of view while they moved. I figure they took Lutz back on that line, and, he pointed a finger toward Jake and Steph. That train came from that direction too. Babe stared at the two walking on the far side of them. We still don't trust them? You can trust them, Babe. I'm not sure enough for the both of us. What about them? He pitched his voice low and shot a look at Weber and Renard. Hell, Babe, you can trust them too. But you won't. I just trust you and Waldo. That's about all I got room for right now. Good enough? Good enough, said Babe. They walked for 100 meters in silence. Just worried about him. Me too, Babe. Me too. Chapter 11. He smelled smoke first. The misty fog clung to the branches of the pines as they worked their way through the woods. Smell that? Waldo asked. Lieutenant nodded. Weber sniffed. Metal. Plastic. Bodies, he announced. You think this place is safe? Lieutenant turned his fast walk into a jog through the trees, moving up past Jake to take point. We need weapons, Weber yelled. Then he saw the bodies. The first was burned into a skeleton, the roasted muscles contracted it into a fetal position. A discarded M16 lay just out of reach. Renard leaned over, scooped it up and checked the magazine with a practiced hand. Not a blaster, he said as he passed it to Weber. But it'll do, they said in unison. Weber and Babe jogged to join Lieutenant as he stared at a former derelict warehouse. Was this it? Renard asked. He spied another dead body, this one missing its lower extremities, rifle still clutched in both hands, and relieved it of the weapon. He took 2 magazines off a belt clip and passed one to Weber. Lieutenant gulped. His blue eyes scanned the bombed-out wreckage of the warehouse that used to hide high command. Looks like the lick made it through round 3, said Babe. Round 3, said Weber. Was that the code for this place? Round 3 of leadership, said Waldo. Lick killed the first round on day 1. Second round a little after that. Surprised these idiots lasted this long, said Babe. They were good at hiding, said Lieutenant. He began moving around the perimeter, eyes roaming over the structure and grounds. You want us to split up? Babe asked. That didn't work out so well last time, said Lieutenant. Babe shrugged, checked the charge on his blaster rifle and followed. Waldo motioned the 2 veterans, Jake and Steph, after them so he could watch them from behind. Bombed from the inside, said Weber. Looks like, Lieutenant agreed. And attacked out here. Yep. Does he always talk this much? Renard spat at Babe. Lieutenant? He's a chatty Cathy most of the time. Unless he's thinking traitorous sabotage. And when he's thinking traitorous sabotage, watch the fuck out. How do you know that's what he's thinking? Jake asked. 'Cause it's what I'm thinking about you, Babe answered. Lots of bad shit has been happening since we rescued you. Starting with Rook. Lieutenant stopped them at the entrance to the compound. It was littered with the bodies of burned fighters ripped apart by blaster fire. Only stormtroopers are so precise, he said. What's a stormtrooper? Steph asked Jake. It's like we've lost all our culture, Babe, Lieutenant complained. I know what they were, said Weber. Movies, right? Nazis, Renard corrected. My grandfather told me about them before. But they didn't use lasers. "It's a movie," said Lieutenant. "At least what I'm talking about. And this is lick work, not some science fiction make-believe." He hunkered down on his knees and stared at the dark hole where the door once was on the warehouse. "Think those food crates had a transmitter in them, like his jacket?" he said aloud. Babe glared at Jake, who shrugged. "They did that on Mars," said Weber. "Bug a supply drop, and follow the radio signal to our posts." "Lick can be crafty sons of bitches," said Lieutenant. "You think Suds was in there?" "Where else would he be, putz?" Babe shouted. "Hey!" Waldo raised his voice. "Don't take it out on me. I didn't lead the lick to him." "No," Babe rushed Jake and pounded him into a tree. He put his forearm across his throat and lifted him off the ground. He did. Steph grabbed Babe's elbow and jerked him off Jake. She twisted his arm around, leveraged him down to his knees, then flipped him over onto his stomach. Babe shuddered a muffled groan as she held his arm up and back, shoulder digging into the dirt. "You know Kung Fu?" said Lieutenant. She shook her head. "I didn't know I knew it." "Let him go. Be cool, Babe. Everybody, just be cool right now. I need to do me some thinking." But what he wanted to do was pray a little bit for Suds. He had liked the man and now he was one more down in his squad. They had taken the fight to the lick, had worked to make the lick fear them, and in doing so, killed a lot of damn people. Or got them killed, which didn't make much difference in his mind. "You think anyone's still alive in there, Lieutenant?" Waldo asked. Bonnie looked at the small squad around him. Babe nursed his wounded shoulder as he shot glares at Jake and Steph. Neither were hurt bad, he knew. The suits had protected them. Weber and Renard stood to one side, armed now with conventional weapons, and waited. He wasn't sure if they were from Mars, or not, but they played the part well. Just a couple of soldiers waiting for orders. He could see his reflection in Waldo's faceplate, his own faceless helmet hiding the doubt and worry in his eyes. No matter what the man inside felt, the image he saw was intense. Inspiring. "Fake it till you make it," he told them. "Lieutenant? We came here to get Suds and turn you two loose to high command," said Lieutenant. "Guess that's gone to hell now, so we're on to Plan B." "What's Plan B?" asked Weber. "It's time for a doctor's visit." Chapter 12. "I don't see how you expect me to get work done with you breathing down my neck like that." Crockett backed away as Doc swung his arms wide to get some room. "I was just curious about what you were doing," said Crockett. "No need to get testy." "Your lieutenant gave me a task to complete," Doc grumbled. "And I am finding it difficult to do given the constraints I'm working under." Crockett glanced at the pristine workbench, the LED lights bathing everything in a soft glow. The solar collectors on the roof were powering dozens of electrical outlets, providing enough juice to operate the tools Doc needed to work on the suits and spread some throughout the compound. "We've been constrained the past 3 years, Doc," said Crockett. "You tell me what you need and I'll get it for you." Doc waved him off. "It's easier for me to find what I'm looking for than to take the time to describe it." He tottered to the far side of the workbench and began picking through the drawers full of miniature pieces that would become the robotic guts of a suit. Burmage paused by the still open wall and cleared his throat. Crockett watched Doc for a second, then moved toward the opening. "What do we have?" "Food," Burmage beamed. It looked out of place on his sallow face, long out of practice, thought Crockett. But the man was trying to make up for lost time since they gained access to the inner room. He double-checked the 2 civilian guards posted on either side of the opening. They were still in place, rifles resting in their cradled arms. "You boys go eat," Crockett told the 2. "I'll stand watch." They shot him grateful looks, and left him with Burmage to go grab their portion of stew. There still wasn't much, not by a long shot. But it was more than they had in months, and with patrols hitting the woods around the hidden base, the hunt could keep starvation at bay for months. "How is the progress?" Burmage peered over Crockett's shoulder to get a peek inside. "He's still bitching." Burmage glanced up at the thin strip of LED lights that ran the length of the corridor, casting light down where none had been seen for 3 years. "I don't see much to complain about." "He doesn't want Lieutenant to be disappointed," Crockett explained. "A disappointed lieutenant is an angry lieutenant. You wouldn't like him when he was angry." "I didn't like him when he was happy either," Burmage offered. "But that's how I feel about all men of violence." "I'm a man of violence," Crockett sounded offended. "I don't like you either." "Well, fuck you too, Burmage," Crockett laughed. "Don't hold it in." Burmage smiled. "I don't," he said. "But I'm grateful." I don't have to like you to appreciate you, do I? He was like that before the aliens invaded, said Doc from the opening. Burmage squeaked, startled. Find what you were looking for? No, said Doc. You should let me help. The programming is done, said Doc. None of that has changed. I just need to upload and adjust the components. I could give it an upgrade. The tech ones couldn't handle the upgrades, Doc said. Oh yes, Burmage rubbed his hands together. I recall that. He's itching to get in there, Doc. Not until our companions have returned, said Doc. Bonnie's orders. Burmage looked as if he was about to protest, but bit it back and swallowed it down with visible effort. Go eat, Doc, said Crockett. You need some fuel for your thinking cap. Thinking cap, Doc snapped his fingers and turned back into the room. He hustled to a different part of the workshop and searched the drawers on that side. It took 2 drawers, but he gave a eureka shout, and went back to work on the partially assembled suit on the bench. Guess he's not hungry, said Crockett as he turned back to guard the door. Burmage didn't answer, just watched inside the room with a look of longing on his face. Chapter 13. Days, Babe grumbled. That's how long it's going to take to get back to the suits. The squad marched along a game trail through the woods next to the road. The pace they set was brisk, leaving Weber and Renard huffing for air as they struggled to keep up. Waldo and Jake offered to carry their rucksacks, which helped at first. But the speed with which the suits moved was difficult for the 2 normal men to maintain. Can't go any faster, said Lieutenant. We'd lose them to who knows what. It's 2 days there, Babe continued. Then how far to Lutz? I don't know, Babe. He's tough, said Waldo. He can hang on. Not if they're torturing him. They don't know he's one of us. But the uniform, said Babe. They all had uniforms, Lieutenant reminded him. Every soldier they picked up from the compound. Besides, Lutz can take care of himself. Least till we get there. If we get there, Babe muttered. Hold up, Weber called out. He pitched against a tree and struggled to catch his breath. Renard slid down beside him, rubbing his wounded leg. We can't keep this up, he said. Lieutenant looked at the bulge in Danish's ruck, the outline of armor pressed against the thin material. 1 suit, 2 men. He shook his head. It wouldn't work. He whistled instead, long and sharp. The abrupt sound startled Steph and Jake, making them jump. He's still out there? Waldo asked. Never left, said Lieutenant. They waited a few minutes, and a shadow moved out of the trees. It was a man-shaped bush, leaves swishing and swaying in a non-existent breeze. I'm busy, said the man in a repurposed ghillie suit. Sorry to disturb your nap, said Lieutenant. You got eyes on a patrol around here? Maybe. These 2 need watching while you point us in the right direction. A leaf-covered hand reached up and pulled netting and a hat away from his face. Cheryl stared at Lieutenant for a moment, eyes hard. I'm not babysitting. We don't need watching, Renard pushed himself off the ground. They can't keep up, Lieutenant explained. You're going to bust a patrol while you wait for them to catch up with you? Something like that, Lieutenant drawled. Why don't you take your finger and point us in the right direction to do some good? We'll kill us a patrol while you bring them along. Cheryl sighed. I don't have a suit. You got one of them banditos practically brand new ghillies. No computer in it, Cheryl huffed. Low tech. It works, don't it? I could do some good in one, he said. You do plenty good with that long rifle of yours, Lieutenant told him. And I need your help. He said it like it cost him something. Cheryl nodded, seemed to understand, as if a secret communication passed between them. The licks have a run about 6 clicks west. You stay on this route, it connects. If I was going to do it, there's a crossroads as pretty as an X where they meet. High ground on the east side. Good spot to set up. If you was doing it, Lieutenant said. Cheryl nodded. How regular? Cheryl made a show of looking at his wrist, the dangling leaves and moss shivering as he did so. There was no watch there. Regular, he answered. That's as close a time as I can get. Lieutenant squinted in the direction he indicated, then looked at Jake and Steph. You need help, Cheryl? For them? Please, he scoffed. They said they were on Mars, Babe told him. Really? Cheryl regarded the 2 veterans. Martians, huh? Got collected. It was Weber's turn to regard him. Renard didn't bow down, but didn't look at him either. Not my lucky day, Weber said. But here you are and Mars is gone. They stared at each other for a moment, measuring, eyes roaming as each took in what the other had to offer. "I'll be fine alone," said Cheryl. Lieutenant nodded. 2 hours. "About that," said Cheryl. "If they can keep up." Lieutenant led Babe, Waldo, Steph and Jake in a trot through the woods. The nanos flowed through his bloodstream, working to repair the micro-tears in his muscles even as they happened. He imagined the tiny robots breaking down the lactic acid in his legs before it had time to build up. Imagined them working on the air sacs in his lungs, helping them expand and transfer oxygen to his bloodstream. He wasn't tired. He wasn't fatigued. The rifle on his arm felt weightless, the pack on his back no more than feathers. He ran faster. His squad increased speed to keep up, and he could tell the miniatures were working on them too. They reached the crossroad in 20 minutes, none of them out of breath. That was. Waldo grinned. "Fucking amazing," Lieutenant finished for him. And it was. They all felt that way judging by the look on their faces. Babe grinned at him. "You want two on the far ridge to set up a crossfire?" Lieutenant hefted his rifle. "I was thinking a little more scalpel than baseball bat this time, Babe." Chapter 14. Weber and Renard followed Cheryl through the trees. "Sure you don't want to walk behind us?" Weber spoke to his back. "We could jump you, take your weapon." They heard him laugh. "You could jump me," he agreed. "But your weapon?" Renard asked. "You have guns. Nothing to be gained by hopping on my back." They paced him in silence, and even though they weren't as fast as the suits, they made good time and arrived at the crossroads in 2 hours and 15 minutes. Lieutenant sat under a tree, visor propped open as he waited for their approach. "You're late," he said. Cheryl waved his empty wrist. "Watch broke," he said. "Can't rush a good walk in the woods." Lieutenant pushed off the tree and propped his blaster over his shoulder. "Nothing beats a good walk," he said as he led them to the asphalt on the crossroads. "Unless you can hitch a ride." Babe and Waldo sat in the open cockpit of a hovercraft studying the controls while Jake and Steph watched them debate the purpose of levers and buttons. Cheryl made a pleased noise in his throat. Scorch marks marred the smooth surface, but it floated 4 feet off the ground in a smooth hover. "It's gonna be a tight fit," said Lieutenant. He helped Weber, then Renard onto the smooth-skirted edge and they scrambled into the open space. Cheryl pulled himself up and settled on the edge of the cockpit. Lieutenant hopped up with ease and stood behind Babe. "Who drew the short straw?" Waldo put his hands on the yoke. "We think we figured it out," he said. One of his fingers reached out. He tried not to wince as he jammed a button. The hum of the engine moved up a notch, then another. Waldo eased the yoke forward. The hovercraft stuttered to a start, causing everyone inside the cockpit to grab an edge for balance. Cheryl slid off the edge and into the cockpit floor. "Probably safer down there," Lieutenant warned. The big man cradled his rifle and wished for a seatbelt. But he didn't need it. Waldo smoothed out the takeoff as the hovercraft accelerated over the blacktop. It gained speed, wind whipping across their helmets. Weber and Renard ducked down on the floor since they weren't protected by suits. Lieutenant gripped the back of the pilot's chair and watched the road. He felt a thrill in the pit of his stomach as they raced along. It had been 3 years since he'd gone this fast, and he had forgotten how much he loved the feeling of speed. The hovercraft cut their time to less than an hour to reach the hidden compound. Lieutenant tapped Waldo on the shoulder as they reached a 5-mile mark and used his finger to point him down. Waldo pulled the yoke back in increments, reducing speed and brought it to an almost smooth stop. "Valet this damn thing," Lieutenant said as he hopped over the side. "I can take it all the way, Lieutenant, it's easy to control." "Waldo, I'm glad to hear it and I've got no doubt in my mind, you're the man for the job. But if this thing's got a tracker on it, I'd just as soon as not take it to our secret suit base." "Oh yeah. Cheryl, you keep watch on it." Cheryl didn't say a word, just slipped over the side and disappeared into the trees. The others joined Lieutenant on the ground. "Is it okay to just leave it?" Renard asked. "We were plagued by bandits at our compound." "We helped the people here solve that problem," said Babe. "Exterminated that plague," Waldo added. "Let's go see what Doc has for us," Lieutenant said. He sent Jake and Steph on point, and let Waldo and Babe cover the 2 veterans as they made their way to the base. Chapter 15. The last 3 miles to the compound were quick. Not as quick as they could have been, but the hour in the hovercraft let Weber and Renard rest their legs, and they moved faster toward their destination. A sentry spotted Jake and showed himself beside a tree. He gave a quick wave, then ran toward the fence. "Early warning system," said Weber. "Need 'em if you're not living under a rock," said Lieutenant. Technically, it was a mountain. "You say potato," Lieutenant grinned. "You were taking us to high command, but now that it's gone," Weber said. "What is this? What are you taking us to?" "A little late for second-guessing," Babe said. "I'm not second-guessing," said Weber. "I'm asking what to expect." "This is a civilian compound," Lieutenant explained. "No one to turn you over to, or into, or even speak about to you." "What does that mean?" Renard asked. "That means you're sticking with us." "What if we don't want to stick?" Renard said. "I don't force nothing," Lieutenant said as they reached the fence. Jake and Steph folded back the cut links to create a tented opening that the others slipped through before they followed. "We're going a mission," Babe told the veteran duo. "Killing licks," Weber nodded to Lieutenant. "We get it's his hobby." "Hobby hell, it's my business." "And brother, business is good," Babe and Waldo parroted together. "Guess you've heard me say that a time or two," Lieutenant shrugged. "Doesn't make it any less true." "You're right, Babe. It is the God's honest truth, and where we're going, it's the land of opportunity as far as killing licks go." "After your man." "After my man." They stopped outside of the door as people poured through the opening. First in twos and threes, then a wave of people streaming down the steps to surround the squad. One of the dirty-faced women clapped, and the rest quickly joined in. A sound of joyous appreciation filled the asphalt lot in front of the building. "What the hell are they cheering at?" Waldo asked. Lieutenant looked around. The squad in suits looked fearsome. Black matte armor, reflective faceplates on helmets. Strong, and powerful. "Hope," he said, just loud enough for Weber to catch. "Hope?" the veteran repeated. "You're bringing them hope?" Babe raised a clenched fist in the air. The act seemed to excite the crowd more. They cheered louder. Waldo saw him, and mimicked the movement. The people clapped harder. Lieutenant waved as he motioned Weber and Renard up the steps. The rest of the squad followed them inside. The crowd followed, growing quieter inside the enclosed structure. "Lieutenant," Crockett shouted. He greeted Babe and Waldo with fist bumps. "Where's Danish?" He grinned. Lieutenant popped his visor. The grin fled as Crockett saw the look on his face. "Damn it," he cursed. Babe shed the rucksack and passed the armor to him. "Suit up," Lieutenant said, his voice soft. Crockett nodded, and carried the ruck after Lieutenant into the lab space. "Doc." Doc jumped, rattling a hanging suit so it sounded like plated wind chimes. "Was that greeting for you?" Lieutenant ignored him. "Are my suits ready?" Doc stood back from the wreck. "I did my best," he said. "Do they work?" "Yes," he nodded after a moment. "I can't run the diagnostics the way we once did, but they are as ready as they will be. And you got the fucking lights on in this place." Lieutenant clapped him on the shoulder. "Good fucking work." Doc glowed under the praise. "Babe, get those two in here." Doc watched Babe lead Weber and Renard into the lab. They gawked as they stepped through the plaster opening, wide eyes trying to take in all of the room at once. "You remember how to put these on?" Lieutenant asked. Weber grabbed the first suit and examined it, hands running over the smooth lines. "All too well." "You're going with me, so suit up." "I thought we had a choice," said Renard. "Yeah, you had a choice of me choosing. I choose you to go." Weber kept a hand on the suit, but stared at Lieutenant for a moment. "I didn't sign up for a suicide mission." "You didn't sign up at all," said Lieutenant. "You were conscripted, at least that's what you told us." "I was," Weber answered, steel in his voice. "We were. And since you were MIA, not Kia, you never gave up the duty." "You're going to win us over on a technicality?" "Nope, no need to win you over," Lieutenant nodded at his hand. "You ain't took your hand off that suit since you got in here." Weber looked at his hand as if it belonged to a different person, but he didn't remove it. "It becomes a part of you," he said in a hesitant voice. "You'll see. It haunts you." "Yeah, well, I don't believe in ghosts," Lieutenant said. But it was a lie. He saw the ghosts of the men he got killed every time he closed his eyes at night. Weber turned to the Doc. "Is the nano there?" Doc nodded. "All of it?" Doc frowned. He chewed on his lip for a moment and nodded again. Weber sighed. He lifted the first suit off the rack and draped it over his shoulder. "Where do I change?" Chapter 16. It felt like slipping into an old friend, Weber thought as he strapped on the armor. The fabric adjusted, and he didn't even feel the tiny sting of the needle as it pierced his skin. What he did feel was relief. Instant, euphoric relief, and the wonder of it brought tears to his eyes. 3 years. Longer still, he had lived with pain. The aches from the crash, his injuries and living as if in the dark ages since returning to Earth. It all disappeared as the nano went to work on his system. Lieutenant watched the man stand straighter. Watched both of them adjust, shoulders thrown back, heads held higher. He was impressed. He had been injured once, and the pain made him want to curl in a ball. He imagined living with it, day after day, and saw the results of its absence in the men. They no longer slumped in on themselves. No longer carried their back in a permanent cower. The robots worked fast, he said. Renard stretched both arms above his head, slow, methodical. I haven't been able to do that since the crash. Weber took a tentative step, like a fawn wobbling across a woodland clearing. By the third footfall, he had it. By the sixth, he leapt as high as he could, the bottom of his feet clearing the workbench. He landed with a grin, and turned to Doc for the helmet. "We're ready," said Renard as he donned his helmet too. Lieutenant watched his scarred visage slip behind the smooth surface of the visor. Now he looked like one of them. "Blasters," Weber said as he moved his arm and head in sync. Lieutenant figured he was practicing the targeting reticle inside the heads-up display on the helmet. "These will be different from what you wore on Mars," said Doc. "The first gen were experimental airtight, but they weren't always effective." "Do we plan on leaving the atmosphere?" Weber's visor shifted toward Lieutenant. "We're chasing Lick wherever they go, but as far as I know, we're Earthbound for the near future." "What else?" Weber asked. "You're feeling the effects of the nano on your system," Doc licked his lips. "The programming is first generation too, so there is a limit to what it can do." "Yeah, we learned that with Danish," Lieutenant said. "Don't get shot." "It's their weapons," said Renard, still testing how the suit felt. "Their designs use something different." Like the hovercraft, Lieutenant thought about the vehicle waiting on them in the woods. How it operates. "I'd like to reverse engineer one." Doc stared through the wall as if he could see their transport hiding in the trees. "Well Doc, we got this one all to ourselves to get a ride to the fighting, but if I can grab you one, I'll bring you back a prize." Doc nodded. "I've got 3 of their weapons," he indicated a pile on the table. "But my focus has been on getting the suits prepared. Now I can turn to the next task, perhaps to offer more help." Lieutenant squinted at the men, then turned to Weber and Renard. "Get on out and wait with the others. I'll be along to outline the mission shortly." Weber and Renard moved with a balletic grace as they crossed the room. "Welcome back," Lieutenant heard the older man say. "I never left," Renard responded, a hint of sadness in his voice. Lieutenant knew how he felt. The suit was powerful, the tiny robots injected into their system even more so. But war did something to you, no matter what you had to fight with. A memory beat against the brick wall he had built in his mind, threatened to tear it down and overwhelm him. He fought it back with a grunt. "Are you well?" Doc asked. "Fit as a fucking fiddle, Doc. Now, you did real good getting those suits ready. I'm gonna need you to fix the hole in this one." He prodded the rucksack with Danish's suit on the long low table. "I think I have the parts." Doc's eyes wandered toward the back of the lab, his mind starting to work on the repair. "Hey, eyes on me," said Lieutenant Focus for just 1 second. "Of course," Doc shook his head and zeroed in on Lieutenant. "You got a couple of pieces of homework, and I don't want you to let the dog eat it." Lieutenant ticked them off on his glove fingers as Doc stared at his golden-tinged reflection in the faceplate. "Suit. See what you can learn about those weapons. Good work on getting these systems up and running, but it's time to recruit some help. You think you got some choices out there in the mix?" Doc looked past his shoulder at the hole in the wall. "Maybe. Burmage seems hot to get in here." "He was a computer programmer before," said Doc. "Not many computers left. We have them, but they draw so much power." "Yeah, well one of them fellas out there knows how to clean a window, don't they? Get him on the roof and clear off the solar panels. Dust and dirt interfere with them catching the sun." One of Doc's eyebrows inched up in surprise. "What?" Lieutenant scoffed. "I was a reader before the lick. I learned me a few things. I suppose I only considered you a war machine. I'm that too. See if you can get this camp whipped into shape. Tighten 'em up and button 'em down." "I don't know what that means." "But you get my fucking gist, don't you Doc?" You know I mean bring this fucking camp out of the dark ages and get it moving like a well-fucking oiled machine. Doc gulped and nodded. Anything else? What? That ain't enough for you? Find some of the daughters out there and marry 'em off to the sons of France to strengthen our alliance. I don't understand, Doc fumbled. It was a fucking joke, Doc. I was trying to lighten the mood cause you looked like I busted your balls a little too hard. Oh. Lieutenant could see the tension in his face, the knots in his shoulders as the man hunched up. You did real good on the suits, he said. You'll do just as fine on working the camp. Doc nodded. I'm sorry about your man, he said. That what bugging you? I know what you're planning to do. I feel you think the suits make you invulnerable. They don't. I got that, Doc. I watched Danish die. And? Doc sighed. What happens after? After what? After you get back from rescuing your friend? Lieutenant leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms over his chest. He popped up the visor so Doc could see his face. Know what I like about you, Doc? Besides your winning personality and brains and shit? I suppose it's my usefulness to your cause. It's cause you think we're coming back. You just said it. When you get back. That tells me something about the way your brain works. And I like it. Lieutenant watched some of the tension leak out of the man's shoulders. Will you? Come back? Hell yeah. Crockett's taken a shine to this place. You get it set up right, it will do just fine. He pushed off the bench and navigated toward the opening to join his squad. Get some rest too, Doc. We're gonna get out of your hair for a little bit, and you did a sprint on those suits. Be ready for when we get back. Then we'll figure out what's next. Doc watched him slip through the hole, and the two civilians popped back into place to act on guard duty. He almost chased after him to find out who was staying, to get more of the plan. But he turned to the bench instead and started pulling out the scorched remnants of the dead man's suit and lined them up on the surface for examination. Chapter 17. Lutz tried not to stare. They beat you if you stared. He did the work the lick soldiers directed him to do. Clean out muck from dark holes. Scrub hovercraft. Move supplies into the main building. Whatever they asked. But he watched from the corner of his eye. He searched the thin dirty faces of his fellow prisoners, tried to pick out the women. Stringy, greasy hair swaying with furtive movements over bowed heads. No one made eye contact. No one talked. They beat you if you talked. Hey, he would whisper if he thought it was safe. Each time he approached a woman. No raspy voice answered him. It got him a lot of scared looks, and women scurrying away from him. God, I feel like I'm in high school, he muttered after the last one. A heavy hand fell on his shoulder, and he cringed, waiting for the blow that followed. When it didn't, he saw a giant man, bone-thin, with hollowed-out cheeks and dark circles under his eyes standing behind him. Come, the man whispered and let go of his shoulder. Lutz almost said no. But it was the first person to speak to him since he heard the girl's voice. And he was curious. The tall man topped 6'6", towering a head above the rest of the prisoners. He walked in a slumped-over stoop, as if working to disguise his height. He shuffled with purpose, leading Lutz on a meandering path through the building. Pick up, he instructed Lutz as they reached a stack of boxes, and took one into his own large hands. Lutz did as he was told. They continued through the building to what Lutz thought looked like a food prep area on the other side, and left the boxes by a back door. The giant opened the door and ushered Lutz through. If they were in a city, it would have passed for an alleyway. A long narrow path between two structures, lined with doors over small concrete pads. Lutz stepped into the narrow slice of sunshine that cut a line of shadows on the far wall and stopped. A woman waited for him there. The door behind him clanged shut. Persistent, she said, her raspy voice carrying to him across the row. Lutz stepped down and approached her. I've been searching, I've been seeking, he said in a sing-song voice. And you found? Who is the square crow? That's Bob, she said. Bob works for me. And you are? She flipped her greasy hair back from her face, almond eyes sparkling with humor. I'm the boss of this here joint. Is that supposed to impress me? It is if you want to bust out. He studied her smooth skin, could see the outline of the bones in her skull too. She was younger than him by a couple of years. You're just a kid, he smirked. How's a kid a boss? Maybe I'm just the boss of you, she smirked back. And Bob, Lutz added. And Bob, she agreed. I'm Lutz, he said. Call me Kiko. You're Kiko. Lutz looked up and down the alley. They were alone, but he could hear the licks and the people around them. "Relax," she said. "The acoustics work to our advantage here. We'll be able to hear them coming from either end before they see us." Lutz nodded, but still ducked into the shadow. "Busting out," he said. "What did you have in mind?" She tilted her head to one side and watched him with her dark eyes. "What every good jailbreak needs," she told him. "A distraction." Chapter 18. Lieutenant stepped into the corridor to a crowd of people watching them. Babe and Waldo stood with Jake and Steph off to one side. Weber and Renard were by each other a little apart from the rest of the group. The crowd didn't clap this time, and he appreciated their restraint. There was work to be done. "Burmage," he called out and watched the small man scurry from behind the people. "You're in charge out here," said Lieutenant. "We got you weapons to take care of your people, keep 'em fed and safe." Burmage nodded. "It's working," he said. "We're still hungry, but not starving. It's a start all right. And a start is all we got. Teach a man to fish and all that bullshit. You keep folks in the woods running circles around this place on a hunt, and you'll do fine. Now these two men," he pointed to the duo by the door, "and two more I'm gonna pick, they work for Doc." Burmage shot a look over Lieutenant's shoulder at the opening in the wall. "Doc is in charge inside that wall, but he's gonna help you, got it?" Burmage frowned. Lieutenant snapped his fingers to get his attention. "When I say Doc is in charge, I mean me, got it?" The leader of the survivors nodded, his jowls jiggling. "He may ask you for help," Lieutenant continued. "It's like me asking for help." "I understand. You take care of your people out here. Doc is going to take care of me and my people from in there." "You're leaving again?" Burmage's hands started rubbing together in small circles, fingers caressing the back of his palm. "That's the plan." "But you'll be back?" "Also, part of the plan." Burmage nodded. Lieutenant turned to his squad. He kept his visor up so they could see his face, but all he could see of theirs was his own reflection. "I told you when we started, we were going to be a lit-killing bushwhacking army. Well," he amended. "I told you three that." He pointed to Babe, Waldo, and Crockett. "I told you some of us would die. I told you we were going to make an accounting for our lives. I think we made a difference. I damn sure know we made a difference in these people's lives." He pointed at the strip of LEDs that ran the length of the corridor. "We brought light back into their lives. And with these suits, we're bringing hope." "Is it enough?" Weber asked. "It's going to have to be," Lieutenant answered. "But there's more than just these folks out there. We got 1,000 more encampments and hidey holes where people are hunkered down. High Command had a list, and if the lick was smart, they grabbed it. That means a whole lot of people are in for a world of hurt, unless we can stop them. Are we shifting into the people-saving business?" Waldo asked. Lieutenant considered for a moment. "The way I see it, Waldo, lick killing and people-saving is the same business. Two sides of the same coin. We have us weapons now and you still owe me. You owe me for the contract you signed when you signed up with this here outfit. You owe me for the men who ain't here no more." "I didn't sign anything," said Jake. "And you two owe me for your freedom. The prices." "All of them," Babe shouted. "All of their heads." "Babe, you have got the soul of the Queen of Hearts." "He's right. I want to double our business. Hell, I want to triple it. But we've got to be careful." "You need more men," said Renard. "We're not enough." Lieutenant nodded. "You know who else thought they weren't enough? The 300 Spartans who held off the immortal Persian army at Thermopylae." "Didn't they all die?" said Jake. "'Cause they had doubt, Chief. Doubt that they could do it. You can have fear in your heart. You can have concerns about the obstacles we're gonna come across. But ain't no room for doubt." "Is that supposed to inspire us?" Jake said. "I ain't in the inspiring business. This ain't a rah-rah speech. This is a telling it like it is talk." He moved among them and motioned them closer. "There's 7 of us. 7's a powerful number. That's 7,000 licks if we do our job right. How many you think they keep on a base?" Weber's helmet moved. 10,000. Maybe more. "That's a lot of lickheads to chop, Lieutenant," said Babe. "No room for doubt, Babe." "I'm not doubting, sir. I just think we need more men." Steph coughed. "Or women." Lieutenant grinned, watched his teeth flash in. The faces around him. "Then it's our lucky day, 'cause I know where we can get the first one." Chapter 20. Smoke, Crockett pointed and the rest of their heads swiveled in that direction. A thin cloud of smoke blossomed over the treetops, trailing on a higher wind in the same direction they were flying on the stolen hovercraft. "What do you think, Lieutenant?" Babe asked. Lieutenant William Bonney squinted at the horizon through the reflective faceplate he wore connected to his helmet. A heads-up display seemed to respond to his thoughts and zoomed in on the column of smoke with 3 clicks. He stared at a closer version and marveled as the composition components scrolled across the screen in front of his retina. "Wood smoke," he said. "Too big for a campfire." "Building?" Babe said. He was staring at his own scroll of information feeding across the faceplate he wore. Lieutenant nodded. Babe put a hand on Crockett's shoulder. "Check it out." He pulled on the yoke to send the alien hovercraft over the trees and angled them on an intercept vector. "Be ready," Lieutenant advised the rest of the squad. He watched Jake and Steph, 2 prisoners who had been conscripted into his war against the aliens, shift in their stance and hold their blaster rifles at ready. Weber and Renard, 2 veterans who claimed to be from the Lost Martian Front, knelt behind the partially raised side of the hovercraft and aimed over the edge. Jake took note and tapped Steph on the shoulder. He imitated the veterans and she followed his example. The hovercraft floated 30 feet off the ground, the color of the smoke changing as they approached, growing darker and thicker. From here, Lieutenant could make out a clearing in the trees up ahead, a patch of forest missing in the dense canopy of leaves. "Circle round," he instructed Crockett, and the man piloting the hovercraft complied. They were too noisy to make a silent approach, and too high to sneak in. The least they could do was change direction, Lieutenant thought. Crockett couldn't set down on top of the trees, so he shot across the edge of the clearing and dropped toward the churned ground. It was a town of survivors, or once had been. 5 wooden huts, burned shells now, still smoldered from blackened piles of ash. "Cold-blooded murderin' sons of bitches," Lieutenant muttered. The ground was littered with bodies. Human bodies. Men were burned beyond recognition, black skeletons curled in fetal positions, weapons tossed aside on some, clutched in the charred fingers of others. Women and children were scattered in front of 2 buildings, only known by the smaller corpses they left behind. "Another bomb?" Waldo offered as they settled on the ground with only a slight lurch. Lieutenant shook his head. He didn't know. They had been at a compound before when the Licks dropped a concussive bomb that took out a lot of people. But those bodies hadn't been burned. The Licks wouldn't want their new slaves unable to work. He hopped over the edge of the hovercraft and blanched as his boots squished into the ground. It was wet with blood, or what looked like it. "Cover," he said as Babe started to get out with him. "Lieutenant?" "Watch the trees, Babe. Anyone left alive is going to come from there." "What about the Licks?" This was no damn lick, Lieutenant grunted. He trusted his squad to cover the perimeter, but readied his rifle as he stepped among the dead. There were too many of them. The entire compound was slaughtered. "I've got to tell you, this gets the Scotch-Irish in me pretty damned riled up," Lieutenant spat. "I got us spending all our time trying to save the fucking human race, and these piece of crap egg suckers go and make all my effort wasted." He saw the bush quiver out of the corner of his eye and whipped around with his blaster. A small scream echoed from the underbrush as he sent a laser shot smoking through the leaves. "Come on out," Lieutenant shouted. Babe and Waldo spread away from him, flanking whoever or whatever it was hiding in the brambles. They watched a tiny hand reach out and lift the greenery to one side. A second hand spread it farther apart and a mud-smudged face peeked through the opening. Large brown eyes blinked at them, dripping tears through the dirt-crusted cheeks. "Come on out now," Lieutenant said, his voice still crisp with annoyance at being startled. A small boy crawled out of the underbrush. He was covered in mud, and darker stains that could have been blood. His movements were frantic, jerky, and he kept watch on the alien-looking men in giant armor aiming guns at him. Steph pushed past Lieutenant. "Lower your guns," she chided. "He's terrified." She kneeled in front of the boy as he flinched away from her. "Hey buddy," she cracked a smile, trying to ease his fear. "He's not a dog," said Waldo. "I've got eyes," she said. "You're talking to him like he's a dog." "I am not." "Here boy," Waldo imitated her voice. "Sounds like a dog to me." "Ask him who he is," Lieutenant ordered. "He probably speaks English," said Steph. Do you speak English boy?" Waldo kept up the high-pitched voice a lot of pet owners used. The mud-covered kid growled. "Sounds like a dog," Waldo shrugged. "I don't know Waldo," said Babe. "Talking to me like that would piss me off enough to growl too." "Cut the bullshit," said Lieutenant. "Ask him what happened." He turned and stalked back to the hovercraft toward Weber and Renard. You two, circle the perimeter, see what you can pick up. Weber glanced at Renard, then readied his rifle. He took a few steps ahead of the younger man, who followed after him, both of their heads on a swivel as they searched for any threats or clues. Steph held out her hand to the boy. "How long have you been here?" He stared at the glove covering her outstretched palm and his lower lip began to quiver. One tiny hand stretched toward hers and settled into her grip. She closed her glove over it, soft and reassuring as his tiny shoulders began to heave, small sobs hiccuping over the still crackling embers of the ash-covered piles. Chapter 21. Lit Commander stared at the holographic image that floated 6 feet off of the floor. His long slender tongue flickered in and out of his mouth, tasting the air and revealing his frustration as he stared at the back of his eminence. His leader had contacted him to deliver instructions and receive a report, no doubt. His nestmate had a hand in arranging this meeting, but no sooner had the bulbous giant leader signed on to the communications array, he turned away from the Lit Commander to consult with his council. It was an act designed to show him his place in the scheme of things, Lit Commander realized. What he had considered an honor, to watch over a nestmate and keep her safe, he now considered as a fellow exile. She was either a spy sent to report back on his loyalty, or exploit his shortcomings in the fight against the humans, or an ally. He had yet to determine which despite sharing his sex with her. The back heaved with laughter as someone he could not see spoke to his leader and amused him. Lit Commander held his shoulders rigid, his yellow eyes narrowed in anger. That His Eminence would ignore him was expected. That he would do so in front of an assembled group of other commanders was insufferable. Lit Commander hoped the nestmate was here to help. He would like nothing more than to eliminate the ineffective and inefficient leadership in front of him, staring with clearing the entire room. A well-placed bomb would do the work, he thought. Something from the human arsenals that would lay the blame on that species of parasites. He wanted to turn away, return to getting reports on the progress of clearing the base with the new slaves. He wanted to return to the nestmate exiled with him, the scent of their most recent passionate encounter clinging to his scaly skin. But he waited. It was what a good soldier would do. Chapter 22. What are we waiting on? Weber grumbled. I thought we were fighting licks. This is wasting time, Renard added. Babe grunted his assent. Lieutenant ignored them. He was good at ignoring a lot of things, years of practice making him an expert at projecting a stony expression. But he heard them. Still, he didn't take his eyes off Steph as she gripped the hand of the dirt-covered urchin in front of them. What's your name? He asked. The kid blanched away from the alien-looking visage bending toward him. Lieutenant nodded and popped his visor open with a snick, revealing ice-blue eyes and a perpetual squint. You got a name? He asked again, making a point to make his voice soft, less threatening than his normal gruff rasp. The kid nodded. Tears and snot mixed together under his nose and turned the dirt on his lip into a muddy mustache. What is it? The kid shook his head. Lieutenant squinted harder as his eyes moved around the squad. That's Babe. Lieutenant pointed to the giant standing between the two veterans of Mars. Waldo, Crockett, Weber, Renard. You're holding on to Annie Oakley there. She squeezed the kid's hand. There, said Lieutenant, now you know us. Want to tell us your name? The dirty-faced urchin shook his head. No? Why the hell not? You're strangers. Lieutenant snickered, an odd sound among the carnage spread around them. Last man standing, Babe snorted. And still won't talk. Lieutenant glared at the death surrounding them, sniffed the air. That's all right, boy. You don't have to tell us your name if you don't want. The kid sobbed and wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, smearing the mud in a long grubby streak. I'm not a boy, he sniffed. Lieutenant squinted harder. Steph pulled her into a rough armor-coated side hug. It's a girl, Lieutenant, said Waldo. My ears ain't broke, Lieutenant answered as he watched Steph try to comfort the girl. Damn. He was looking at her, but his mind was taking a trip, one of those quick memory flashes that steal up on a person and carry them off, usually when things are quiet but on occasion when the timing wasn't perfect. He looked beyond the mud and tears, around the armored arm and into the soft lines of her face, the youthful cheeks sunken, the coarse hair matted and ratty around her face. Clothes, layers of them, hiding the frail young body. Lieutenant was staring at a girl who might have been the same age as his daughter, had she lived. Fucking licks, he growled, and the little girl flinched, cringing into Steph's suit as fire flashed in the lieutenant's eyes. Your folks in there? He rasped. She nodded, the tears all gone, or just cried out. Give her a drink, he told Steph and handed her a hydration pouch from a pack. The little girl took it and sucked on the end like she hadn't had water in days. Steph let her get 2 mouthfuls and pulled it away before she drank too much and got sick. "Ask her if she saw what happened here," Lieutenant instructed. But he was sure she had. "Young eyes shouldn't be that haunted." "I can hear you," she said, her young voice stronger now that it was wet, though still thick with tears and sadness. "Then answer if you can," Lieutenant snapped, the words coming out harsher than he meant. Certainly, harsher than he would have spoken to his own daughter, harder than he intended. "I can," she snarled back. "Soldiers." She sniffed again and swiped at the mud on her cheeks and face. "That it? Isn't that enough?" Steph answered for her. "You knew it wasn't aliens." Lieutenant nodded. "Lutz," Babe reminded him, an attempt to steer him back to mission. Lieutenant waved him off. "I ain't forgot, Babe. I'm just saying, we can file that rugrat into the hovercraft and get going. She can tell us whatever story she wants on the way." "We could leave her," said Waldo. "We're not leaving her," Steph huffed. She held out her hand to the little girl and flexed her palm. Lieutenant made a circling motion with his finger. "Let's go if you're going, rugrat." He marched past Weber and Renard on his way to the hovercraft. "What kind of outfit are you running here?" Weber whispered after him. But if Lieutenant heard, he didn't answer. Chapter 23. Lutz stared at the back of the girl, but she wouldn't turn her head to look at him. No one would. No one dared. The other prisoners walked with a practiced shuffle, heads bent low, eyes watching the toes of their dingy shoes. Lutz was surprised at how fast they learned to adopt the walk, as if there was an unwritten code about how to act on the base. Or maybe he wasn't so surprised. He had watched another prisoner get his head bashed in for staring. That kind of instruction made an impression. That kind of instruction got everyone in line quick. He cleaned a hovercraft under the slit yellow eyes of a lick soldier that roamed over the working trio. He watched the 6-foot lizard from the corner of his eye, seeming intent on the task in front of him, but studying the way it stood, how it held the blaster in its 3-clawed hand. The guard's eyes blinked once, twice, then closed. The tongue that was normally flicking in and out to taste air, to taste scent, was still. Lutz couldn't believe it. The soldier guarding them fell asleep. He kept moving, kept his motion slow and controlled, and turned his head ever so slightly to get a better look. Yes, the yellow eyes were closed, the snout frozen in a mask of respite. Lutz couldn't help it. He grinned. He almost motioned to the man next to him, to show him that the soldier acting as their guard was catching a nap. But he needn't bother. The man noticed, dropped the mop he was using to scrub soot marks off the hole and pounded across the pitted asphalt toward the fence. A second guard lifted his rifle and sent a blaster bolt searing into the fleeing man's back 100 yards away. The laser almost sliced him in half, the upper torso pitching over even as the legs ran 4 more steps before falling in a splattered heap. The lick who fired the round stepped out of hiding behind a building and watched the rest of the slaves to see if any were going to make a run for it too. No one did. He slid back into the shadows of his cover and Lutz lost sight of him. 2, a small voice whispered beside him. Maybe 3. The sound of it sent a thrill up his spine. It was the voice from the darkness. The raspy sound made him want to smile almost as much as the still snoozing guard. "Did you know?" he whispered back. "We suspected. Now we know." Which made Lutz wonder. Did the man sacrifice himself just to give the raspy-voiced girl the intel? He turned his head to look at her, but only caught the back of her dark hair as she scooted away. She was slight of frame, the clothes on her frame oversized making her look even smaller. He couldn't see her face, just the shape of her from behind, and even that was distorted by the fabric she wore. But it was her. He was sure of it. There was no mistaking that voice. And whoever she was planning an escape. Chapter 24. Lieutenant shifted onto his haunches in front of the fire, cradling the rifle in the crook of his hips. He almost held out his hands to warm them, and pulled back after a moment of hesitation. He wasn't cold. The suit took care of that. It was just a habit, born of spending the last several hundred nights sleeping outdoors. The suit took care of a lot of needs. The nano inside of him modulated his hunger, his thirst. It modulated his adrenal production, and he suspected it controlled his sleep as well, dropping melatonin in his system when he decided it was time to catch some shut-eye. Wonders, he thought. He stared into the flames and thought about Lutz. He let his mind drift over the possibilities of planning, what they were up against, and it flittered from idea to thought and back again. Sometimes he liked to do that, just let the jumble of everything inside his head bounce around, bounce off each other, hoping maybe one or two will click together and form a plan or the kernel of a new idea. Brainstorming, they called it, and he liked the way it felt because there was a lot of thunder and lightning cracking around in between his ears. He glanced at the group around him. The fire threw shadows across their bodies, playing against the trees. Too large, he thought, too easy to see, but he drew up short from kicking dirt over the edges to tamp it down. They deserved a fire, and if any prying eyes from Lick or enemies otherwise unknown saw it, he wanted them to bring it on. His squad was hard to identify in their suits. Babe looked like Waldo, Crockett looked like Jake. All the same, all uniform. Hard to tell who was who unless the visors were up. "That won't do," he muttered aloud. "What did you say, Lieutenant?" Babe sat up. "Just pondering some ideas, babe. Been thinking on our next step." "Get Lutz." "Yeah, that and one more stop to make." Babe glanced over at the still lump of a child under a pilfered blanket near the edge of the firelight. "Drop off," the big man nodded. "We're picking up a lot of strays." He was ready to be rid of their new charge. "We're not strays," Steph said from across the clearing, her back against a pine tree. "You rescued us. We're just joining the cause." "Is that what we are?" Waldo joked. "A cause? Name's as good as any," Lieutenant said. "Course if you folks had been raised up right, you'd call yourself the Rebel Alliance." "That movie again, Lieutenant?" He nodded, earning a couple of half-grins and smirks. "You boys don't even know," he said. "It defined a generation. Practically a documentary." "My dad liked it," said Babe. "Jesus, Babe, I ain't that much older than you. I guess I'm just more educated on things that matter." "Like space movies." "We're in a space movie," said Jake. "The truth was out there, and then it came here." Weber popped his visor up. "You talk too much when it's time to sleep," he said. "Real soldiers learn, eat when you can, sleep when you can." "We're real enough," Waldo said. "How many licks you got notched up?" Weber shrugged. "I've got over 100, Waldo continued. "Oh, the lieutenant about 900 more." "How do you keep count once the killing starts?" "After," said Babe. "It's a head count." He waited for them to get it, but Weber just stared at him with his sky-blue eyes glowing in the reflected firelight. "We take their heads," the big man clarified. "I understood you," said Weber. "I just don't understand the reason." "We aim to make the Lick fear us," Lieutenant said. "The Lick will have nightmares of the atrocities it has seen in the path of destruction we carve through their invasion." Weber sat up, grunting as he propped against the tree. The nano had went to work on his injuries as soon as he dropped in the suit, and his body felt good. The grunting was habit for the most part, the aches ghosts of the pain they had once been. "How's that working out for you?" he asked, blue eyes curious in the firelight. Lieutenant pondered this, arms crossed across his knees. Truth be told, he wasn't sure if the Lick were checking under their beds at night to see if he and his men were there. There damn sure was enough of them left to kill, that the numbers he and his squad had sent to meet their Lick maker didn't seem to faze them much. "I suppose we could do better," he offered. "You've been hitting the soldiers," said Weber. His eyes drifted to a point over Lieutenant's shoulder, staring at a blinking light in the sky. A distant star, he thought, though he remembered hearing that you could see Mars from Earth sometimes. He wasn't sure what part of the sky it liked to hang around in, so it could be Mars. Or Polaris. Or Alpha Centauri. But Mars made him think of past battles and reasons they were lost. "There are so many of them," he said. His voice was a growl across the clearing, carrying to everyone. Lieutenant noted that no one slept, except Rugrat, and if she was awake, she was doing a fine job of fooling everyone into thinking she was not. "Everywhere we went, across the face of the red planet," Weber continued. "So many? At Citadel, thousands. They kept coming from all over. And when we moved on the colony, to take out the guns, more. Out of the sand, out of every hole. Like ants when you kick over an anthill." "Or hornets," said Renard, with the same far-off look in his eye. "When you hit a nest." "That's how they beat us?" Lieutenant asked. "Just sheer fucking numbers?" Weber shrugged. "Numbers. Deck. Maybe just indomitable fighting spirit." He nodded past the hovercraft in the direction where they had found the burned town. "Sometimes we're too busy killing each other to stop the aliens from killing us. Hell, if they would have held back a couple of years, we would have finished the job for them." Lieutenant grunted. He had no answer for that. Sure, Earth had some problems before the Lick Armada popped up on long-scanning radar. Politicians had even tried to keep it quiet for a while, but too many backyard astronomers with eyes in the sky made that impossible. And still they fought each other. Even as they sent soldiers to Mars, the countries jockeyed for power, for position, for lines on the map, and once humans started losing, for resources. Lieutenant sighed and squinted at the embers. "I hear you," he said. "Don't seem like much worth saving sometimes, don't it? Every worthless perkerwood in the bunch seems to show up when we're at our lowest, trying to set themselves up a little potentate. Makes me wonder why I even bother every time I look in the mirror." "You got a mirror, Lieutenant?" Crockett joked. "Cracked one," Lieutenant grunted back. "That explains the shave," his man shot back and earned a snort of appreciation from his commander. "I wonder why, if I'm being the philosophical sort and the mood strikes me right. But that kind of thinking stretches back all the way through history. Seems like we always done this. Invasions brought out the worst in a lot of folks. But I think we leave out some of the best parts. The good ones don't always make history, or history lessons at least." "That why you're fighting?" Weber asked. "You want to go down in history as a good one?" "Hell no, Weber," Lieutenant scoffed. "I want to be the damn Pol Pot of the Licks. I want to kill every last one of those motherfuckers and put all their damn heads in a rocket and shoot it toward their home world as a warning. I want them dead. Gone and scared as hell to come back. I don't give a shit how history remembers me. I just want there to be a history to remember." "Do we still have rockets?" Jake asked. "What?" "You said put their heads in a rocket and shoot it to their home. Can we do that?" "That's a tomorrow problem." Lieutenant slipped back off his haunches and settled into the ground. "Rockets are tomorrow. Lutz is tomorrow. Dropping that rugrat off is tomorrow. Tonight's problem is getting shut-eye." He laced his fingers across his chest and stared up at the stars. The dry wood in the fire popped and crackled as he heard the others settle in around him. He didn't know if they slept, the silence didn't share that much. But he watched the sky spin above him for a long time, until the eastern edge of the horizon slipped dark purple to hint at the dawn, and he was able to drop into a deep nap. Chapter 25. The next morning dawned under wispy strands of fog that filtered through the trees and cowered over the still smoking embers of the campfire. Lieutenant kicked a pile of dirt over the glowing coals, burying them. "Why did you do that?" a small voice asked from beside him. He glanced at Rugrat through his visor. "Keeps from starting a forest fire. Only you can prevent forest fires," he grinned, even though she couldn't see it. "A forest fire? Damn kid, ain't you ever seen a wildfire gone wild?" She shook her head. "I don't like fire," she murmured and cast a glance over her shoulder in the direction of the still smoldering town on their backtrail. "I bet you don't," said Waldo as he stepped up next to Lieutenant Perimeter Clear. "Crockett, start this boat up and let's get going." He led them into the back of the hovercraft as Crockett engaged the throttle and lifted off of the ground. Lieutenant studied the road in front of them, letting information scroll across the display on his helmet. It took some getting used to. The system was set up to deliver temperature, windage, distance to objects as they entered his field of vision. It also monitored vitals, and he could see a space where oxygen levels would show, but it was blank for him. That made sense. The suits had been designed to fight in the harsh and unforgiving atmosphere of Mars, and would need oxygen. He wondered about how he was getting air now, here on Earth, and made a mental note to ask Doc about it when they got back to the compound. If they got back, he thought. He wondered if the suits were giving them too much confidence. But no, his small squad had done plenty of damage before the suits, still using the old-school technology they had been left with after the alien first wave sent them almost literally back into the Dark Ages. The confidence to take on a base with such a small force came from the ability to beat the Licks so many times. Plus, he was still thinking about a distraction. Something to draw the main force of their troops away from his point of entry, then hit them from the flanks and behind. It was the sort of problem he couldn't hit head-on. It was like running into a brick wall through a mud hole. Slow and heavy. The way he needed to figure it out was come at it from the corners. Let the different inputs fall together in his mind, until all the pieces fit like a puzzle to show him a new picture. That's just the way his mind worked. Dump a lot of data into it, and figure it out as he went. "Lieutenant?" "Yeah, Waldo?" "We're following the wrong trail." Lieutenant glanced over the edge of the hovercraft. "Nah. Crockett's doing exactly what I asked him to do. What we need him to do. Lutz has to wait while we find the assholes that did this?" Lieutenant nodded. "Something like that." "You know Lutz is going through hell waiting on us," said Babe. "No, Babe, I don't know that. For all we know, Lutz is gone." He said it, but he didn't feel it. He found it when Leroy and Danish and Suds died. Same with Rook. But not so with Lutz. Thing is, Lutz is pretty good at taking care of himself if he's in trouble, and he can keep his head down. But this, he indicated the rugrat. This needs looking into. Chapter 26. The hovercraft slowed to a halt and settled on the edge of the road. Lieutenant hopped out and marched to the ridge where the asphalt looked like it disappeared. It was an optical illusion. The road rose to the point of the ridge and slipped over the other side. Lieutenant stood at the highest-most point and let his eyes wander. The shimmering ribbon of blacktop kept going down a long glade that stretched for miles. The grass on either side of the road was long, still green under the sun but with blooms of yellow hinting that the dry weather roasted the pasture. The road kept going through the land below, crossed a sliver of river on a suspension bridge and got lost in more woods on the other side. But that's not what drew his attention. Another camp was set up on the riverbank. Camouflage tents were erected in tight circles that made 3 rings, each surrounding a giant pavilion in the middle. "Wonder who they think they're hiding from?" Babe snorted from next to him. Weber and Renard sidled next to Babe. "What are they?" Renard asked. "That's the fellas that decided to burn up that town back there," Lieutenant growled. "How do you know?" Weber asked. "It's them." He pointed to the churned-up ground next to the asphalt, boot prints imprinted in the mud, the grass flattened. "Big force came through here and they weren't flying on hovercrafts." "Could be someone else?" Weber said. "Who?" The veteran shrugged. "You've seen something like this before?" "Nothing," said Waldo as he joined them. "Of course, we haven't been this far out of the forest in forever." "That's a big group," said Babe. "Ain't normal," Lieutenant observed. "Attracts too much attention. A group like that, they're asking for trouble, or expecting it. If the licks come along, the ones in the middle are getting protected. And if it's humans, that setup is supposed to be intimidating." "So, we're intimidated," Weber said. "I'm feeling something," said Waldo. "I don't think it's intimidated though. How about you, Babe? You feel intimidated?" "You're just remembering standing next to me at Privy this morning," Babe said. "Afraid you'll never feel like a real man again." Waldo laughed and shifted his blaster up. The targeting software zoomed in on the camp. He could make out people moving, just vague shapes from this distance. "Too far to shoot," he said. "Save your bullets," Lieutenant said. "I'm going down there to talk." "Lasers, Lieutenant, and is that a good idea?" "I'm not going alone, Babe. One of you is coming with me." Babe stood taller. "Not you," said Bonnie. "You and Weber are going to sneak up on the other side of the road. Be ready to pull my bacon out of the fire if it comes to it." "Then who's going with you?" "I will," Jake volunteered. "Chief," Lieutenant glanced back at him. Babe frowned, but he didn't say anything, just waved Weber to follow him. Lieutenant watched the 2 suits march up the far side of the road. "Let's go, Chief," Lieutenant said. "We're walking?" "Crockett, keep everyone loaded up. You see trouble, you either come in to pick us up, or you get gone. Savvy?" "Yes sir, Lieutenant." Lieutenant led Jake on the asphalt. They trotted into a fast jog and ate the miles away to the camp below. Chapter 27. "What's your name?" he whispered in the semi-darkness. None of the lights worked in the warehouse where they were imprisoned, but there were windows along the top of the building that let in dim starlight. Not enough to make out details, but shapes. He recognized her by the shape of her head and felt another thrill in his stomach as she turned. There were guards they could see posted on either end of the building, but Lutz had found space in the middle, a piece of concrete to call his own. And the shadow crab crawling across the floor to sit next to him moved with a slow precision that wouldn't attract attention. "Don't move so much," she said as he rolled over to face her shadow. "You crawled over here," he reminded her. "But I've had more practice than you." "Crawling?" "Crawling, sneaking. I saw you. You don't seem like much of a sneaker." Lutz snorted. "I'm an excellent sneaker." "Oh yeah, when have you ever snuck up on anything? Snuck around anything? You make too much noise, attract too much attention. Strutting." "I don't strut," he said. "I'm a..." He stopped short of telling her he was a soldier, one of Lieutenant Bonney's men. While he bet she didn't know who exactly Lutz was in the scheme of the squad, William Bonney's exploits had spread among the surviving human population. Babe was the most popular of the men, he knew, and didn't begrudge him the title. There was something to be said about being an effective unknown member of the most devastating team to fight back against the alien invaders. But this girl could be a spy. And if she wasn't, there were people around who might be. They could turn him in, trade on his identity for safety, or food, or hell, even survival. "You're a what?" she whispered. Damn, thought Lutz. He hoped she would miss it. But she was paying as much attention to him as he was to her, straining to make out more in the milky glow leaking in through the upper windows. "I'm just a prisoner, like you." "Slave," she scoffed. "But not like me." He heard a noise in the corner, from the direction where the guard stood and held his tongue. He could feel her holding her breath beside him. Around them, people snorted and made the kinds of noises people make when they're sleeping. But Lutz noticed they were muted sounds, as if even in the act of sleeping, the prisoners were afraid of being noticed, of being found out. The two of them held their silence, stretched for several moments, long enough for Lutz to wonder if she had fallen asleep. He strained to listen to her breathing, to measure the rise and fall of the dark lump at the edge of his field of vision. "My name is Pomona," she said. "Like the horse?" Lutz whispered back. "Like the city in California," she sounded sharp. Lutz knew what her nickname would be if Lieutenant met her first. Cali. That was the only thing he could think of, and when it popped to the forefront of his mind, he snorted a small laugh. He'd been hanging out with Lieutenant too much. "Carl," he said. "But call me Lutz." "Why not call you Carl?" "Because everyone calls me Lutz." He could see one of her shoulders heave, and assumed it was a shrug. "What are you, Lutz? You were going to tell me something." "You're planning an escape," he said. She was quiet then, and he was reminded of something else Lieutenant told him. Sometimes, it was best just to keep your trap shut and wait for someone else to talk. Something about he who speaks first, loses. In this case, Lutz figured it was she who speaks first, and he wondered if she was planning to test him. It might have worked. He would have tried to find more ways to get her alone, to pursue her agenda, to find out the plan. But she didn't make him play for it. "I am," she whispered. "I want in," Lutz told her. And as the night stretched toward morning, he listened to her plan. Chapter 28. "I don't like this plan," Jake said. He felt like huffing, because in the past he had. He jogged with Lieutenant, an 8-minute mile that felt like nothing to the two of them as the nanos surged in their system and controlled the aches, the oxygen delivery, the lactic acid removal. "You got a better suggestion, Chief?" Jake shook his head. He didn't. What he had was a nagging feeling that this was the wrong play. "It doesn't feel right," he shared. "Being out here, just the two of us, going into the lion's den?" Again, he shook his head. That wasn't it. There was something about the camp that felt off, something about the situation that bothered him. But he couldn't put his finger on it. "It doesn't feel like a trap," he said. "I studied it," Lieutenant told him. "It's not a trap." "Then what is it? Why is it bothering me?" "Chief," Lieutenant said, "I think you've got what we call pre-battle jitters. Your body's producing adrenaline in anticipation of the old fight-or-flight reflex, only this time we ain't going up against the fucking licks. We're taking the war right into the heart of a pile of humans. It don't sit well with you." "I don't think I care about that," said Jake. "Well, I fucking do," Lieutenant growled. "I fucking hate it. This is a waste of my fucking time, trying to bring a bunch of damn idiots into line, time that could be spent fighting the real enemy. But human nature, being what it is, requires me to iron glove the shit out of these fuckers to bring them back in line. I care about it quite a bit." Jake ran beside him in silence as the miles to the camp dropped away. He considered the human encampment as they drew closer, and wondered if he did care about the fact that they were not aliens. He wasn't bothered about the confrontation they might have. He wasn't concerned that they were people instead of aliens. If there was fighting to be done, he would do it. What bothered him was the timing. They were in a stolen hovercraft on the way to the alien base and just happened to run across a group that tortured other humans. Lieutenant was right. It was a waste of his time to deal with it, but to Jake, it felt more like distraction. He screamed as a flaming ball of rubbish arced through the air and smashed down on the asphalt in front of them. It exploded in a cascade of flaming debris, showering their suits with sticky burning pitch and flames. Jake screamed as he watched his arm burn, waved it to try and put out the fire. Then he realized he didn't feel the heat. Nothing burned through the suit. The fire scorched the exterior, but he was all right. A second round ball of flames arced up into the sky. "Are they using fucking catapults?" Lieutenant screamed and aimed his blaster. He sent a laser shot into the ball at the height of its flight, creating a miniature supernova that rained embers, coal and flaming debris on top of and around them. Jake took a knee and rested the blaster against his shoulder. He searched the area where the flying cannonballs were coming from, and saw tiny figures working around a cart, with a long wooden arm on it. Trebuchet! Lieutenant screamed and shot a blast into the group. Jake sent 2 more after his, clipping one of the ropes holding the arm down. The tension slammed the arm forward, the torque so strong it flipped the cart over, and trapped several of the men manning it in the flaming wreckage. They could hear the screams of the dying men as more figures raced out of the woods. They were armed with hunting rifles and pistols, a couple of M16 automatic weapons, and all aimed at the 2 soldiers in suits on the road. An order was screamed, and the howling group opened fire. Bullets pinged into the suits, ricocheted off. Lieutenant and Jake stood under the onslaught. It hurt. But the suits were bulletproof against conventional weapons and neither man was harmed. Like being hit with a stick or a bat, and Jake thought about Babe. As if thinking of him brought the man to life, Babe and Weber ran in from the woods and flanked the men attacking them. Lieutenant sent 1 warning shot into the crowd, blasting 3 men into smoking chunks of ruined flesh. Babe and Weber sent a shot each, laying out 5 more men. Then the man who screamed the order to fire now screamed retreat. They group broke in panic and ran back toward the tents. "Do we chase them?" Jake stood up. Lieutenant reached over with a gloved hand and patted the flames off of one of the boy's armored arms. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose we should. Think they won't feel like talking too much now we done killed so many of 'em." "You sound disappointed," said Jake. Lieutenant started marching up the road, past the still smoldering bodies of what once had been men laid to waste by his blaster. "I don't like killing humans," Lieutenant said. "Even fucking scum of the earth murdering sons of bitches like these." Jake watched Lieutenant pull ahead as they got closer to the tent city set up on the side of the road. They were closer to the riverbank than he thought, a small shallow dip that ran 20 feet to the swirling water below. Jake saw clothes spread out on the blue river rock to dry, and heard people screaming as they approached. Babe and Weber joined them. "Old-fashioned weapons," said Weber. "I've only read about those in history books." "What were they?" "Catapults," said Weber. "Trebuchets," Jake corrected. "What's the difference?" Babe asked. Jake shrugged. "It's what Lieutenant said." "If they had those, they might have built shit," Weber shouted and shouldered them both to the ground. A 6-foot arrow sliced the air over their head. Weber whipped his blaster to his shoulder and had enough time to watch another arrow plow into Lieutenant's chest plate and knock the man backwards, narrow wooden shaft vibrating as it stood straight up in the air. Chapter 29. Lit Commander stared at the nestmate stretched in front of him, the lazy gaze of her yellow eyes watching him as her tongue flickered in satiated pleasure. "He underestimates you," she hissed. Here, in the privacy of his chambers, they could forego the voice box translators worn on chunky chains around their throats, but she kept her chip on, so he did as well. The humans had a saying he had heard of, and he found it very fitting. "When in Rome." It translated well to his native tongue. He preened under her adoring gaze and worked to remind himself that she was trained in the art of making even the lowliest soldier feel like his eminence. Part art, but he was open to the possibility that she was right, that their leader did indeed underestimate him. A part of his subterfuge, he told himself. But also his fear. Perhaps all underestimated what he was capable of achieving because they could see the truth. And if they were able to see the truth, then the concubine lounging in front of him, basking in the afterglow of their sex, would be a liar. If she could lie about such things, one thing, then she could lie about everything. To his detriment, Lit Commander answered. "Will you share your plans with me?" His tongue flickered in and out, masking the indecision. He took a calming breath. She would taste his fear, his indecision. She would taste all, and perhaps report back, though he had monitored no communications from her chambers. That did not mean she didn't make them, just his techs could not discern them. "They are yet complete," he hissed. "The humans on the base have been replaced. But our initial purge of the infestation had an unforeseen consequence. There were no skilled humans left. The slaves they brought to the base were little more than janitorial staff, working on the maintenance of the occupation. Cattle to be burned through and discarded. Easily replaced. But the slaves who showed promise, the ones who knew the secrets of the world, were now too hard to find. That didn't mean he wouldn't unlock the secrets that nestled in the heart of the base, behind hidden walls and locked rooms. Those would be broken, those would be pillaged. They would give up their secrets to him, and he would in turn, decide what to share with his eminence. Decide how to share it too, his skin rippled in pleasure. The commanders of the Mars campaign, his mind still reeled at the way he was thinking even, more human every day spent in this sector. Those commanders spoke of weapons the humans possessed that could harm his people, destroy them even. It was the reason his eminence enacted the elimination protocol, the reason they slaughtered so many upon arrival. But those weapons were lost in the purge, and the men who knew about them, the humans who knew how to make them, gone as well. I would see him gone, she said. And you in his place. He rippled again. She shared his dream, but again, it was her skill, her training to do so. Yet, he pondered. They were far enough from the home world that he could rule this sector, this galaxy with the thousands of habitable planets to seed, to colonize and conquer. He could imagine himself at the head of it all, an eminence of his own. But before the dream could capture him, before he got lost in the what-if of it all, he turned away from her. "It is as you wish," he told her. "Things move fast and there is still much to be done before we reach that point." Chapter 30. "Shit," Jake screamed. He wasn't sure if any of the others heard him, but he saw Lieutenant go down and drop to his knee again to return fire. Laser blasts shot over his head and sliced into the crowd. The others had seen too. The tents caught on fire as the bolts seared through the dry canvas. People screamed, men yelled, and over it all the rat-a-tat of automatic weapons shooting back at them. Weber stooped next to Jake. "Advance in a line," he shouted an order. Jake turned his visor and saw Renard line up next to him on the other side, blaster raised. Crockett and Waldo exited the woods on the opposite side, lasers skewing across the smoke-covered battlefield. Jake stood and marched forward with Weber and Renard, his gloved finger depressing the trigger again and again. Everywhere he aimed, death followed. He tried to concentrate on the men, or male-looking figures, though it was hard to tell with most. Each figure in his sights was a cloth-covered moving mound of clothes, faces hidden by scarves or heads hidden under hats. He aimed at the ones with weapons. Guns that were firing back at him. The trio advanced in orderly fashion, shooting as they moved. Bullets bounced off his chest plate, off the armored arms and thighs of his suit. Once or twice, a ping rocked his head back, sending a searing headache bouncing around his skull. They reached Lieutenant's fallen body. The tip of the spear was a triple blade, barbed with hooks so that any attempt to remove it would rip skin and gouge muscle. It was buried inches in the armored chest plate, testament to the force thrust of the crossbow used to shoot it. Weber stepped to one side to move around the body, still firing as he moved. Lieutenant sat up. "Son of a bitch," he yelled. It wasn't much of a yell, but the torrent of curse words he released on the tail end of the yell matched the staccato tempo of the machine gun shooting at them. The bullets slowed down when he rolled to his knees, and stopped completely when he stood up. Jake quit shooting too as he stared at the lieutenant like he was rising from the dead. The rest of the squad paused as well, blasters held ready just in case. Except for Babe. Babe shot 8 more men, their heads disappearing into puffing mists of blood and smoke. "Babe!" Lieutenant screamed. It was more like a rasp than a scream, but it cut through to his crazed soldier and made him stop. "I thought you were fucking dead," Babe snarled. "Fuck me, I thought I was too. Never been hit with an arrow before." Lieutenant looked down at the 6-foot shaft wiggling in his chest plate. "That was a good fucking move you did there, Weber. Didn't need you to save my bacon this time, but it's nice to know you've got it in you when I need it." Weber nodded. "Standard formation training," Renard said, weapon still nested into his shoulder. "Standard, huh? That shit works on Mars, but if those fuckers use a grenade, you're toast." "Are you hurt?" Crockett and Waldo jogged up from their flank position. Lieutenant reached up and wrapped his glove around the shaft of the arrow, yanked it out. He dropped it on the ground and used the tip of his fingers to explore the rent in the chest plate. "Didn't get through," he said. "Huts like a son of a bitch though. That's gonna leave a mark." "Fireproof," said Jake. "Bulletproof. Arrowproof." "Ain't idiot-proof though," said Lieutenant as he turned back to the camp. "So, let's go get our fill of dumbasses." He started marching toward the camp again. "Come on boys, before they get a chance to reload that fucking crossbow contraption." Chapter 31. The escape plan was simple. As simple as something Lieutenant would come up with, thought Lutz. "Tonight?" Pomona breathed out of the side of her mouth. He was surprised it sounded more like a question than a statement. The plan was to create a distraction on one side of the camp, draw the lick guards to that point, and make a break for it on the other side. The main worry was hidden guards. Hidden traps. Hell, Lutz could make a list of a million ways this could go wrong. Lieutenant would tell him that's the wrong way to think about it. Anytime you start concentrating on things going wrong, Lutz told himself in Lieutenant's raspy voice, that's all you're going to see. He even squinted his eyes in a fair imitation. Try to see what will go right and do more of that. Lutz remembered sharing an eyeroll with Babe over that one, but Lieutenant had been right. The more they focused on killing licks and doing it the right way, the better they got. The more he focused on staying alive, the more alive he stayed. It stood to reason that if they focused on what could go right during the escape, then things would go right. He tried not to think about the slaves sacrificing themselves so others could get away. That tended to freeze him up, as his mind turned the problem over trying to find a way to save everyone. Every human at least. But their sacrifice would buy many others a chance. A chance to die in the woods, being hunted, or starving, or being killed in the attempt. He shook his head. Too easy to think about the wrong. The way it was going to go down, 6 people would die. He had a small head count of 30 making the escape. 30 people running to the woods, running through the trees. It was stupid to even try, he thought. They were going to die. But Pomona had a plan for that too. Break up in pairs. No idea where they were in the world, not sure which way to break once they were beyond the fence. She told them find the North Star and follow it. Lutz didn't know what was north, and if the pairs had a half-mile between them, if they got separated in the woods, they could walk a parallel track and never know the other was there. But as far as half-assed plans went, he thought it wasn't too bad. For his part, he was going to keep the herd close together if he could. It's what Lieutenant would do. He finished up the work in the hangar by twilight, still worrying and working over the plan in his head. Lutz made his way back to the warehouse cell block in a line of other slaves. All of their heads hung low, all shuffling. He matched them step for step all the way to the door. They entered under the watchful eye of a single soldier, tongue dancing in and out of its snout, as if tasting their defeat, their exhaustion. Searching for defiance, thought Lutz, eyes still down. There was no set space on the floor, no designation to wander back in, so he moved to the center of the room where no one else was and sat with his back to the wall to wait. His brain wouldn't work the way he wanted. He couldn't figure out to keep all of them safe. He was just one man in this plan, just one man trying to get away, get back to Lieutenant and get back to killing. He needed his weapon, or any weapon to do that. I'd be better out there, he told himself. Better for any one of these survivors. I could do more good for them out there, he thought. He realized he was trying to rationalize their deaths. When there were so few of them left, even the death of one was a big loss. But he was just one man. Twilight melted into darkness and the absence of ambient light made the stars pop out and twinkle against a velvet sky. It was almost time. Lutz tensed and clenched his muscles, first stretching out one leg, then the other. He wanted to be limber when it was time to move. Then it was. A glass bottle shattered at the entrance to the room, showering the wall with gasoline. A second bottle sailed through the air, the brilliant yellow-orange flame burning the back of his pupils and popping blue flashes as it seared the darkness. It smashed against the wall, spreading more gas and fire across the wall. Weak screams echoed through the warehouse, and Lutz felt a surge of bodies press against him as they sought to escape the flames. He lunged into a run, pelted across the warehouse, bouncing off bodies as he ran. The lick soldier at the rear lifted his blaster as 4 bodies swarmed on top of him, carrying him down with their weight. The laser blast was brighter than the flames, searing a red streak across his vision as it ripped through 2 of the men piling on the lick. Then he was through the door, into the darkness and a crowd of people who broke for the fence. The hidden guard, the one Pomona had feared, leaned out and began picking off the runners one by one. But again, sacrificial lambs piled on top of him, 5 this time, trading their lives for an opportunity for others. 3 of them took it out of his perch, and thudded to the ground, where 4 more piled on top. One of the men grabbed the alien blaster and tried to use it. Lutz could have told him it wouldn't work, not for human fingers anyway. Maybe it was DNA-coded, they never found out. But lick weapons wouldn't work for humans. The same could not be said for vice versa. A 50 calories machine gun opened fire on the rest of the humans as they sprinted toward the fence. It was older machinery, the thud-thud-thud of the belt being fed sounding more like a movie than real life. But the bodies sputtered, and twisted and fell, just like the movies too. the dark earth growing darker in the starlight as blood blossomed in fountains or leaked out of the fallen. "This way," Pomona grunted in his ear and pulled on his arm. She led him away from the slaughter, at the head of a group of 4 more. They ran around the corner of the building, ran between it and another. "In here," she said and hauled open a door. Lutz and the other men surged after her, into the pitch-black opening as dark as a cave. He plowed into the back of her as she stopped. Lights popped on in exploding brilliance, bathing them in yellow incandescence, pinning them in the middle of another warehouse. Frozen. Caught. 24 soldiers created a semicircle around them. 24 blasters aimed at the 4 men. Lutz decided to charge them. Weapon or no, he wasn't going to die cowering on the floor. He was going to go out fighting. He took 2 steps into a run. "Excellent work," Lick Commander hissed, his gaze settling on Pomona as she jittered to the line of soldiers and slid through. Lutz stopped and stared. The men around him were dumbstruck as well. "These are the leaders of the escape?" Lick Commander asked. Lutz watched as he separated from the rest of the soldiers, and strutted toward them. His yellow eyes studied each of them in turn. "Smart?" he asked. "I do not think it's smart of you to seek escape. But she knows the ways of humans more so than I." He stopped in front of the last man in the row. Lutz thought he may have once been burly, but now skin sagged from his too thin face, shoulders slumped at the betrayal. "Are you intelligent human?" Lick Commander hissed. "I am told you are able to determine things." He made a motion with a claw and the soldiers surrounding them marched forward to drag them away. Lutz looked around for Pomona as 2 Licks yanked his arms up and hauled him after the others. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and he felt a twinge of sadness that she didn't look guilty or even bothered by her actions. Chapter 32. Lieutenant halted at the first row of tents and squinted at the vague shadows that darted among them in the interior rings. "My name is Lieutenant William Bonney, and if any more of you sons of bitches takes a shot at me, I'm going to come in there and kill every last damn one of you." He lifted his blaster rifle and sent a shot 7 feet off the ground, just over their heads unless there was an especially tall man among the group, but low enough to warn the rest. If they saw it. He had some doubt. The laser blast was bright, but the flames were turning some of the tents into infernos, and the thick smoke was making it difficult to see. "Herd him into the river," said Lieutenant as the rest of his squad caught up to him. Weber and Babe fanned out in one direction, Jake, Waldo and Renard in the other. They worked their way around the ring, and the people inside fled toward the river. They huddled in a mass of shivering confusion, the row closest to the water shoving back to keep from being pushed in and pushed under. Either end of the group was blocked by laser-toting soldiers in suits they hadn't seen before, and one of those soldiers stood in front of them and addressed the group. "Which one of you is the leader of this here outfit?" Lieutenant drawled. He cocked the blaster rifle on his hip and let it drift over their heads. "Come on, step up now and don't be shy. Sure as shit wasn't shy about shooting me with a damn bow and arrow a minute ago." Crossbow. A skinny man with a gray beard stepped from behind an even thinner woman, pushing her scrawny frame aside and resting his hand on a pistol-worn cross-draw. "That so?" Lieutenant squinted at him. "Are you really Billy the Kid?" "Fuck you," said Lieutenant as he let his blaster drift lower. "Don't call me Billy the Kid. My name is Lieutenant Bonney. For your purposes, you can refer to me as Lieutenant Bonney, though I will still answer to Lieutenant, if we get along." The blaster stopped as it reached an angle with the man's face. "We are going to get along, aren't we?" The man stared into the bore of the laser and gulped, his beard bouncing up and down, black eyes half glaring as if he was trying to decide how much a smart remark would get him shot. Then he nodded. "I don't think the folks in the back can hear you," said Lieutenant. "Are we going to get along?" "Yes," the man stuttered. "Yes." He glanced over his shoulder at the people around him. "Don't cause them any trouble," he turned back to Lieutenant. "I thought you were only fighting the aliens, not people just trying to survive." "That what you call this?" Lieutenant fingered the gash in his chest plate. "Surviving? We didn't know you were humans." Lieutenant looked at Weber and Babe. They didn't look human. Humanoid maybe. With the visors down, they were certainly intimidating. "Now I'm a reasonable man," Lieutenant said. He let his eyes drift down to Jake, Renard, and Waldo. "I can see where you made a mistake thinking we were something we were not. But now that you know what we are, just men in body armor, you can admit you were wrong." Lieutenant locked eyes with the gray-bearded man, trading squint for glare. "Takes a big man to admit when he is wrong and apologize." "You want me to apologize?" Lieutenant just stared at him. to you?" "You did shoot him," said Babe. He kept his blaster locked into his shoulder, and aimed over the crowd. Ready. Just in case. "He was shooting at us," the graybeard squirmed. "You all were." "Were we?" Lieutenant called out. "Chief, you shoot off first? How about you, Babe? Waldo?" A chorus of no sirs echoed around the silent crowd. "All right then, that's what I thought," he motioned the gray-bearded man forward. After a moment, the man complied. "I ain't here to play the blame game or even to blame you for trying to kill me," Lieutenant said, leading him away from the crowd. "It was a simple case of mistaken identity. Live and learn. I think that's a good lesson to walk away from in this." The older man nodded. "But, I did come to ask you a question," Lieutenant continued. "If you're in charge here, did you give the order to torch that town back there?" The man tensed, eyes going blank. His lips compressed in a thin line, and Lieutenant knew that whatever he said next was going to be a lie. "There's a village back there?" "Playing dumb." "That's pretty much what I figured you would say," Lieutenant sighed. "Seems like you don't like to do nothing the easy way." "We're just trying to surviving in this world," the graybeard said. "Yeah? At what cost?" "Excuse me?" "Seems like we should be united in our fight against the lick," Lieutenant said. "Not killing off the few of us left. My people are hungry." "Did you ask them to share?" "Who?" "The town back there. You called it a village, but I think the population was enough to call it a small town, so that's how I'll refer to it. And you killed every last one of them. I'm responsible for their well-being." Graybeard pointed at the people huddled by the river. "Oh yeah? You got them fishing for food? You got them hiding under trees? Out here in the open like this, seems like you would be right picking for the lick patrols that use this road." "They leave us alone," the man answered. Lieutenant snorted. "How'd you manage that?" "An arrangement," said the man. Lieutenant watched his hand drift to the pistol he wore on his belt, nervous fingers scratching the scarred wooden handle of an ancient Colt peacemaker. "What kind of arrangement?" Lieutenant murmured. "We don't have guns like you," Graybeard said. "We're reduced to using whatever we can scavenge or build on our own." "What kind of arrangement?" "We just want to be left alone," he said, fingers wrapping around the butt of the pistol and releasing. Spit flecked on the corner of his lips. "Out here in the open, right next to a lick quarter, and you think you're alone." "They leave us alone," the man explained. "The arrangement?" Graybeard nodded. "What do you have to give up to get that bargain?" No answer. "That town? Others like it?" He didn't nod. That would be too much of an admission. But his head moved. He breathed out and his fingers gripped the pistol again. "Trying to work up to something." "How many?" Lieutenant growled. "How many survivors have you killed? Traded?" "As many as it takes," the man glared back. He didn't draw though. Lieutenant wanted him to do it. Wanted him to try to fight, try to make a run for it. Even if it wouldn't do him any good. Bonnie stuck the barrel of his rifle under the man's chin and pulled the trigger. The laser blast seared a hole through the top of his head, misting the air with a puff of blood and smoke. Graybeard stood up straight and stiff as the electrical impulses in his brain went into overdrive and shut down in an instant. Lieutenant reached out and gripped the peacemaker, lifting it out as the man fell. "I shot first," he said as he turned to his squad. "When you retell this story, it's always I shot first." Chapter 33. "I don't have a stomach to kill all of these people," Weber said and lowered his rifle. Lieutenant shoved the procured pistol into a pocket on his backpack and sniffed. "I don't aim to kill 'em all," said Lieutenant. "They ain't licks." "But you killed that man," said Weber. "Yeah. Do you think they're going to stand for it?" "You know what these people are, Weber? Slavers. They kill and capture their own people to give to the licks to do God knows what with. But it's as good as killing them once they give him over." Weber let his eyes travel over the cowering crowd. "There are women and children in there," he said in a voice just above a whisper. Lieutenant sighed. "I've got a woman and child up there. One's a soldier, one's an orphan," he jabbed a finger at the crowd. "Made that way by them." "You can't kill them," Weber stated. "It makes us no better than them." Lieutenant nodded. "I don't want to kill 'em," he said. "But I can't leave them out here to block me when we come back with Lutz." "I hate this," Weber groaned. "You should have just left us in the mountain." "Send him back to the base," Babe suggested. Lieutenant stared at the corpse with a hole in its head he had left several feet away. "Might be like sending the fox into the henhouse, Babe." Babe shrugged. We can't take a kid on a rescue mission, and we can't leave these people here. They might not have real weapons. Get shot with a giant crossbow and tell me how fucking real it feels, said Lieutenant. I meant ones that can hurt us. Lieutenant tapped his chest. Fucking hurts, babe. Gonna leave a mark and everything. You gonna let me finish or keep busting my balls, Lieutenant? I know where you're going with it, big guy. We spent way too much time together. Hell, I'm practically a mind reader now. Babe smirked. Tell what I'm thinking right now? And fuck you too, buddy. Listen up. He turned to Weber and motioned the others to circle up. The rest of the squad pulled a semicircle around him, blasters ready for the crowd if they needed it. You two, he pointed at Weber and Renard. Get Crockett and take the sponge back to the base. Oakley's gonna go with you, do the babysitting of that rugrat till you get there. He eyed Babe. That what you thinking, Babe? Split our forces so we can do twice as much? Babe nodded. Chief, Waldo, Babe and me are gonna go get Lutz, Lieutenant continued. And find you a fucking bat. You don't look right without one. Chapter 33. Lutz was third in line as the LIC commander led them into the bowels of the facility. The base had once housed a military installation, but the invasion scoured the humans and their defensive measures upon arrival. Lutz had no idea where they were, but he realized the small warehouse that held hundreds of people was just a fraction of the base. He had been kept on the periphery of the grounds. Now, he tried not to gape. The facility was composed of a giant building, built around a massive spaceship. It looked like a cross between the space shuttle pictures he had seen, and a massive cube. Lutz had never been in space, and the last rocket to Mars the humans had sent was years ago. There were no televised launches back then, as if the world leadership wanted the population to forget an invading force was one planet over and a few years away. Launches were done in secret, as was most of the weapons development used to fight the invaders. Those weapons had been sent to the Red Planet, Lutz knew. And when the Licks made it to Earth, they destroyed everything else. Humans were reduced to fighting with rocks. Not literally, he knew, but in a practical sense. The drones were gone. Aircraft gone. Everything more advanced than an RPG, disappeared or stopped working, along with cars, electricity, running water. Hell, humans couldn't even use horses and wagons anymore. LIC patrols zeroed in on anything that moved faster than a run. Now, here he was, staring in wide-eyed wonder at a marvel from beyond the stars. When it didn't blast off into space in a roar of flames and the smell of rocket fuel, he got bored with it. Sure, it was an impressive structure. Large and intimidating, it dominated the landscape, squatting like an alien structure that didn't belong on the planet, thought Lutz. Besides, it looked like a small skyscraper he had seen pictures of, and who could be scared of a building? Even a building filled with 7-foot scale-skinned lizards. He'd killed plenty of Licks to not be scared of them. The man in front of him started moaning. Hey buddy, Lutz whispered to his back. Just be cool. Don't attract their attention. But the man kept moaning. Shit, Lutz groaned. This is not good. It wasn't. The man launched himself at the LIC commander's back. He was able to latch on, wrap his arms around the thick lizard neck and start squeezing. Then his head vaporized, leaving a smoking stump on his neck and a scorch mark on the wall. The body slipped off the LIC commander and plopped to the floor. The alien turned to the remaining 4 men. I hope he wasn't the smartest among you, the voice box hissed. Then the LIC turned his back on them again and kept walking. He wasn't afraid of any of them, thought Lutz. But let me get a weapon and you will be. Chapter 34. They're gone, said Babe. Lieutenant studied the 3 men in front of him. Jake, Babe and Waldo kept their visors open as he locked eyes with each of them. Some folks might argue a bigger force is better, said Lieutenant, but I'm going to say it right now, this is a damn fine group of boys to have at my back. He turned to Waldo. Think you can fly this damn thing? Waldo nodded. If Crockett could do it, it'll be a piece of cake. I ain't had cake in 4 years, said Lieutenant, so maybe you'll make it a little easier than that. Waldo nodded. No worries, Lieutenant, I got this. We'll go in along the road, he said. Stick with that part of the plan at least. I don't know how this place is going to be guarded, I don't know what the layout is like. He watched Jake for a reaction. What about you, Chief? Anything coming back? Jake shook his head. Still don't remember anything about it, he answered. Would help us out if you could. Jake shrugged. I'll try. but he didn't sound like he meant it. Lieutenant motioned the quartet to move forward, spread out in a line, single file. He wasn't sure how far they had to go yet, but the suits made the distance easy. Babe gave voice to his true concern. "You think we're enough, Lieutenant? You think the four of us can get it done?" Lieutenant nodded. "Yeah, Babe. We got a damn good chance, I think." "Even with him?" Babe nodded to Jake's back, just behind Waldo on point. Lieutenant didn't know how to answer. Jake could be an asset or the distraction they needed. "We'll see, Babe." Chapter 35. Lutz paused behind the man in front of him and sucked in a deep breath. "Whoa," he exclaimed. The man behind him muttered an echo of surprise as he peered over Lutz's shoulder. "You seeing this too?" Lutz said, even though he knew the man was. "I'm not dreaming, am I?" "Make this work," Lick Commander hissed from somewhere behind them. They had followed a Lick soldier into the bowels of the base, through a long dark tunnel that seemed to stretch for miles but was probably just several hundred meters. There were no lights for the humans to see. Lutz shifted over to one wall while there was still a dim outline of the entrance where they could see. He put one hand on the wall and let it trail along, praying there wouldn't be a break to throw him off or worse, some denizen of the dark reach out and grab him. He felt rather than heard the other humans move closer to the wall too as the darkness turned complete. Lutz had heard of the phrase, "You can't see your hand in front of your face," but had never known what it meant until they were deep into the tunnel. He had always had starlight or the moon, or even firelight coals glowing to see by. This was the absence of all light, the walls complete with no windows, no doors, except the entrance they had passed through and an ending, he hoped. One they would reach soon. Lick Commander hissed them to a halt when they entered a grand cavern and brilliant lights clicked on, flooding the building with lights that popped blue flashbulbs in his skull and made him wince and cover his eyes with his hands until they cleared. When they did, he stood awestruck with the others. "I've never seen one in real life," said one of the men. An XSJ Starcraft shuttle perched on the floor. It looked like a Hornet, thought Lutz, except with on yellow or green on the body. Slick lines on a matte black skin, tiny windows where the eyes should be. He knew it was an XSJ thanks to his brother. Before the Licks invaded, his older brother was obsessed with the war on Mars and built models of the military's finest craft to hang from their shared bedroom ceiling. The XSJ was not a fine craft. It looked mean enough, and the military touted its ability to destroy the enemy with stealth and precision. But it had a greater than average odds of blowing up on takeoff, and so the production was halted and the prototypes mothballed. Lutz bit back a quick feeling of missing his brother as he remembered the know-it-all lecture he got on every subject. His brother was an asshole, but he missed him. Chalk another death up to the Licks. Lutz glanced out of the side of his eyes and calculated taking a weapon and opening up. "Make it work," Lick Commander hissed again and retreated into the darkness of the tunnel. He was replaced by 6 Lick soldiers who spread across the black opening to pen them in. Lutz looked at the other men. "Any of you guys know how to build a rocket ship?" "It's already built," said one of the men. "Then we're halfway there," said Lutz. He didn't know what that meant, but if the Lick wanted to put him in proximity to a potential weapon just so they could figure out how it worked, he felt he owed it to them to learn just that. Then turn it on them. Chapter 36. "We're just gonna fly it in," said Waldo. The Lick base was nestled in a valley between 2 small mountains. A series of ridges ran up one mountain, like crumbled broken steps dotted with pine trees and anemic evergreens. The road ran over one of the ridges and through a series of switchbacks, as if the government that built it hadn't wanted to spend the money to blast a straightaway to the door. Each section of the road that dipped behind a ridge gave them an opportunity to hide from view of anyone on the base. It also gave anyone on base time to set up a welcome party if they were identified. Waldo pointed this out. "We don't look like a Lick patrol." "They're going to be lazy," said Lieutenant. "They're going to see one of their own ships, and they won't know anything's gone sideways till we're on top of them. And then it's too late." "You could be underestimating them," said Jake. He was staring at the rail line on the far side of the compound that drilled straight into the heart of the buildings and ran along a line to the mountain on the far side. "Don't give a Lick credit for thinking for itself," Chief warned Lieutenant. "Lick got lucky, that's all." "They wiped us out on Mars," Jake snapped. "They almost killed the human race here. I don't think you're giving them enough credit." "You know how many Lick we've killed, Chief?" Lieutenant squinted at the young man. "Ain't nobody knows what they're capable of better than me. Lick didn't kill most of the human race, that was damn human stupidity doing it for 'em. Infighting, jockeying for power and position. Fuckers took their eyes off the prize and were the ones paid the price for it." "I think you're overestimating us," Jake said. His eyes never left the railway tracks. "I don't overestimate nothing. I don't underestimate neither. What I do is make a plan that ain't gonna survive contact with the enemy. None ever does. So we improvise. We overcome. We adapt," Babe added. "Looks quiet." "That's what I was thinking," said Waldo. "I figured Lutz would have stirred them up." "If he's alive," Jake muttered. "See those little dots down there, Chief? Those are people. If those people are alive, then Lutz is alive." "You don't know that." Lieutenant shrugged. "You might be surprised at what I know." The tone of his voice made Jake jerk his head over and look at him. But Lieutenant was glaring at the gates manned by a lit guard. He could spy others scattered around the compound, and a cluster of humans in front of what looked like a warehouse. "All right, here's what we're gonna do." Chapter 37. "Here's what you need to do," said a human voice from the other side of the starcraft. Lutz didn't jump, even though he was startled by the sound of it. He thought it was just the four of them. A paunchy man with long stringy hair stepped around the side of the derelict space shuttle and blinked at them. "He told me he was bringing help. I guess you're the best he's got?" "The best you're going to get," said Lutz. The man stuck out a grimy palm. "Johnson," the man said by way of introduction. "Lutz." They shook. Lutz watched as he introduced himself to the others. "He told you we were the best?" Lutz asked. "Yeah," Johnson answered. "I've been telling him I need help down here if I'm going to get it started for him." "You told him?" "Yeah," said Johnson. "You're working with him?" Lutz tried to keep the edge out of his voice. He had heard of collaborators before. Hell, they'd run across a few before and it didn't end well for them. Lieutenant hated collaborators almost as much as he hated licks, and he really fucking hated licks. "Just trying to survive, man," said Johnson. "You guys have any mechanical training from before? Computers?" He ran through several other options, waiting for one of the four to nod. When he got nothing from any of them, Johnson sighed. "I don't know what he expects me to do." "Make it work," Lutz hissed. Johnson chortled. "You don't sound like him," he snorted. "But don't let them hear you do it. You could really piss them off." Lutz glanced at the line of guards as they stood unmoving. "If I gave a fuck what they thought, we'd be in trouble." "Well, I've managed to avoid trouble so far, so let's keep it like that," Johnson said, and this time, there was a harsh edge to his voice. He turned and puttered back to an open panel on the shuttle. The interior was a mass of circuits and wires under a thick shielded hull. There was an oversized 3-ring binder on a rolling workbench, open to show 2 pictures and diagrams. Johnson tinkered with a small green monitor on the cart with wires attached to a motherboard inside the craft. "I don't know how he expects me to do this," he muttered as he double-checked the connections. "They fried all the tech when they landed. This thing hasn't been working right." Lutz kneeled and looked into the belly of the starcraft. Did the hull shield the components? He wasn't sure if that was even possible, but his brother liked to talk and Lutz thought he remembered him talking about something like that. A new prototype had the capability, but Lutz wasn't sure if it was the XSJ or some other starship. "They say yes, I say I don't know. I can't get any readings from the ship, and I can't get it turned on to run an onboard diagnostic." Lutz rocked back on his heels and studied the wiring. It was a jumble to him, and made no sense, but he wanted to buy time and make the lick think they were working on it. "How long have you been at this?" "Months," said Johnson. "But he's getting impatient." "He?" "The lick commander. He's planning something." "With this?" Johnson nodded. "What?" The man with the paunch shrugged. "I don't know how his mind works. But he's a crafty one." Lutz kept his mouth shut and studied the ship. But what he was really looking for was a weapon and an opening. Chapter 38. Lick Commander returned to the room where the nestmate was resting. "Is it done?" she asked. He licked the air. "Not yet." Her yellow eyes narrowed. "These humans are worthless," she stated. "We could return in my vessel." Lick Commander shook his head. "It would be unexpected, but a tactical error," he said, and didn't explain himself further. He knew she would not argue tactics with him, even if she thought she understood the overarching strategy. "I grow impatient," she said. "In time." She had been here for weeks and she grew impatient, he thought. He had been here for years, since Phase 1, and working with the humans grew tiresome. "My talent is wasted," he thought, and turned his back to her to stare at a monitor that showed the grounds around them. Human slaves working on the base. Human prisoners brought to him by other humans to buy their own lives. Such a species, his tongue flickered in disgust. He was destined for grander things. Even though he wasn't of ruling stock, he knew he could rule better than the current occupant of the throne. She slid off of the chaise lounge and joined him at the monitor. The nestmate of His Eminence, sent to spy on him, he thought, but perhaps his ally, a champion for his cause. "Do we have time?" she hissed. It was a question he wondered himself. Chapter 39. Time. Lieutenant screamed as the hovercraft vaulted over the closed hurricane fence. Babe leaned over the side of the craft and blew the head off of the lit guard in pop of vapor. Lieutenant, Waldo and Jake stared out at the grounds, rifles ready to meet the response. But there was none. Instead, the craft barreled 9 feet off the ground over the unkempt cracked asphalt that looked like a blackened version of the alien invader's skin. After a few seconds of quiet flying, Waldo pulled his rifle down and took command of the yoke again. "Lieutenant?" "I'm thinking," Lieutenant said. He expected a response. But no one seemed to notice the dead guard, no one paid attention to the hovercraft as it approached the cluster of buildings that made up the center of the compound. Closer now, he could see the humans shuffling with their heads down. That's why they didn't respond to the assault. But the guards with them should have noticed something. Except they didn't. So bored or used to the routine, they didn't even notice the quiet approach of the hovercraft or the single shot of the blaster rifle that took one of their numbers. "Set her down," Lieutenant instructed. Waldo steered for a row of hovercraft and landed with a small bump on the far end of the tarmac in line with the others. "This is where it gets interesting," said Lieutenant and signaled them over the side. They hopped out with the craft between them and the rest of the base, a buffer and screen in case they needed it. There were Lick soldiers milling several hundred meters away, but they didn't glance in the direction of the soldiers in suits. Lieutenant remembered something his grandfather had told him when he was a kid. "Act like you own the place and nobody would bother you or ask you questions." The man usually said it when they were trying to get away with something. Nothing illegal, just stuff like sneaking backstage to meet some country singer the man liked, or trying to get some behind-the-scenes peek at what was going on somewhere. Lieutenant wasn't even sure if it would work with Lick. Alien psychology wasn't even close to human reasoning, and the doubts a person would experience in the face of authority might not exist with the Lick social structure. But what's the harm in trying, he thought. "Line up, follow me," he ordered in a low voice. "Eyes up and move like you mean it." He marched across the tarmac toward the warehouse where he had seen the prisoners gather. No one bothered them. No one called out a challenge, or sent a bolt blasting into them. No one even seemed to notice them. Lieutenant glanced back at the squad to make sure they were keeping up and stopped. Babe whipped his rifle around, ready to fight, but the aliens still ignored them. "Your suit," Lieutenant indicated and stared down at his own arm. The suits were changing, shifting in patterns of chameleon colors that matched the background and surrounds of the buildings they were against. "It's camo," said Babe as he stared in wonder. "Doc didn't tell us about this," said Waldo. "Wonder if he knew?" Lieutenant ran his eyes over the display in his helmet, wondering if the scroll of information could help him. He found it in the lower right corner with the words "innate screen." "It's the damn nano," he said. Waldo looked from Babe to Jake and back to Lieutenant. "The Licks can't see us." "Nah," said Lieutenant, "I think we're just harder to see. We stand here long enough holding our peckers, one of 'em's bound to come along and shoot it off for us." He started toward the warehouse again and didn't wait to see if the others fell in line. "Scorch marks," Babe pointed out. "That entrance is new." Lieutenant saw it too. The front of the building had been hastily repaired, the burn and shoot marks of a fire still evident on the exterior of the structure. Broken windows flickered in the sunlight on one side. 2 Lick soldiers stood guard on the doorway, watching the last of the slaves trudge in from their various workstations. The air around them flickered and part of the wall detached. They had just enough time to slip out their tongues in surprise before 2 pops turned their faces into scalding mist. Waldo grabbed one body and dragged it into the room. Babe grabbed the other. Jake and Lieutenant moved in behind them. "Watch our 6, Lieutenant instructed the boy. There were 2 more guards at the far end of the building. Lieutenant used a hand signal to send Babe and Waldo to dispatch them while he studied the inside of the warehouse. He was glad he couldn't smell through the helmet. He saw pockets of prisoners huddled in small masses on tattered and lice-infested blankets. They were crammed in tight, at least 100 of them in a space where 50 would be crowded. Babe and Waldo dragged the guards on the far side into the building and jogged back to him. "Why aren't they reacting?" Babe asked. Lieutenant wondered the same thing. The sudden appearance of soldiers in suits should have started a surge of chatter or at least a reaction of some sort. Instead, the prisoners stared at them with weary exhaustion and creepy silence. "Let's get Lutz and get the hell out of here," said Waldo. He popped up his visor with a snick. "Lutz," he took a deep breath and gagged. Babe slid his visor and snickered. "Lightweight," he chided. "Lutz." Jake ran up with a prisoner in tow. "Lieutenant," he said. "This one asked for the one in charge." Lieutenant looked at her, but kept his visor down. "He said Lutz." She pointed at Babe. "You know him?" Babe shouted as he tried to hold his breath. Waldo slid his faceplate back in place and cursed the stench of unwashed bodies and death that seemed to cling to him in his suit. The girl nodded. "They took him on a special work detail," she said. Lieutenant noted her thin arms, thin legs and greasy hair. She would have been pretty under different circumstances, but as a prisoner, she looked haunted and beaten. Sores crusted the corners of her mouth. "You know where?" Lieutenant asked. She nodded. "Show us," Babe ordered. She nodded again and led them toward the back door past the two deadlit guards. Lieutenant saw she didn't flinch. In fact, she was a pretty cool customer for 4 suits showing up in the middle of her giant prison cell. "Something squirrely," he said to Babe. Babe kept his rifle ready as he followed her. "Yeah, but she knows Lutz," he answered. The girl led them through the back door and across the compound. Another warehouse stood with the door ajar. He went in there. She stopped and pointed. Lieutenant held Jake back. "Check it out," he told Babe and Waldo. They 2 soldiers went into the building and came back seconds later. "It's empty," said Waldo. "But there's a door on the other side, goes into a tunnel." Lieutenant turned on the girl. "You know where that tunnel goes?" She shook her head. "Is that the work detail?" Again she shrugged. "Damn it," said Lieutenant. No plan survived contact, he thought. "Take her back and tie her up," he told Jake. "She's a prisoner, Lieutenant," Jake protested. "Just till we come back through with Lutz." Jake shook his head. "Yes sir," he agreed. "You cover us till we get back, keep this way open. We can grab a hovercraft from here." He watched Jake lead the girl back to the hovercraft, then led Waldo and Babe into the second warehouse. Chapter 40. There, the nestmate tapped her claw against the monitor to draw the commander's eyes to it. He stared at the apparition from the past. 3 suits marched through one of the facilities and into the dark tunnel toward his human spaceship. "They do not look like the other humans," she hissed. "They are not like the other humans," he answered. "They wear the battle armor we encountered when first on the red planetoid." "Warriors?" she breathed, tongue twirling to taste danger or fear. He had none for her. "I have encountered these before in space," he told her. "I know their weakness." "Send in the fodder and destroy them," she advised. But he shook his snout. "That is not their weakness," he informed her. She watched him turn and stalk across his command chamber to a small alcove recessed into the composite wall. He keyed a sequence into the coded lock. A section of the wall whisked upwards to reveal a small compartment, large enough for him to stand in and move around. The LIC commander entered the tiny room and shut the door behind him before the nestmate could see what was inside or ask any questions. Chapter 41. Lieutenant moved against one wall out of habit. He didn't need it for cover. The tunnel was pitch black on the exterior of the suit. Inside his helmet though, he could see as if it was daylight. The heads-up display gave him a graphical representation of the area they moved through. Babe and Waldo trailed after him, spaced out so they could react if something happened. He expected it to happen soon. His gut was twinging like a drum, and he bet the nano inside of him was working overtime to counteract the adrenaline dump his brain was doing. He could feel it, the edge of anticipation and almost excitement before engaging battle. He fucking hated fighting, but a small part of him loved it too. And he didn't like that about himself, but he accepted it. Lieutenant supposed that was why he was pretty good at it. Fighting, that is. Killing the LIC. There was no inner conflict to make a bullet stray, or the blasts from this first-generation rifle he held now. He was okay with killing the aliens, okay with killing the humans that collaborated with them, and the suit made it easier to get the job done. It also made him feel more robotic, though he wondered if that was because he kept catching glimpses of his squad out of the corner of his eye before, or even himself in a reflection on their faceplate. He looked like a robot, so he felt like a robot inside. "Damn nanos," he muttered. Maybe the miniature robots inside his system were making him feel that way. Or maybe he just missed the keyed-up feeling from the adrenaline. He figured that was it, because he could still feel. "Feel like killing licks," he said under his breath. Babe made a questioning noise behind him. "Heads up," said Lieutenant. The end of the tunnel appeared in growing shades of brightness and they slowed to a crawl. Lieutenant led Babe and Waldo to a harsh edge of light that demarcated the end of the tunnel. Bonnie held up 2 fingers on his right hand to indicate the guards on his right. He pointed to Babe, and pointed the fingers at the back of their lizard heads. Babe nodded. He repeated the action to indicate the 2 on the left to Waldo, and the soldier acknowledged with a half salute, then raised his rifle to his shoulder. Lieutenant shouldered his own weapon and took aim at the back of one of the guards. He fired, and the tunnel filled with 6 flashes of light that vaporized the lit guards. Their bodies hadn't even hit the floor when the 3 armored suits sprinted into the room, breaking formation. Babe flanked right. Waldo flanked left and Lieutenant ran up the center. Another guard whirled around and got off one shot that went over Lieutenant's head before he was drilled in the snout by a bright beam. Babe took out another. Johnson screamed and turned to run, the other humans joining him, but there was nowhere to go. Lutz grabbed a pipe and turned to face this new threat. He drew back over his shoulder and prepared to go down fighting. "For Babe!" he screamed and charged Lieutenant. Bonnie dodged to one side and Lutz missed. Lieutenant slid his visor up. "What the hell, Lutz, you gonna go after a superior officer like that?" Lutz dropped the pipe and tried not to cry. "Lieutenant!" he screamed and wrapped his arms around the suit. Lieutenant pounded him on the back as Babe and Waldo ran across the room. Lutz saw Babe in the suit and let go of Lieutenant to grab his best friend. "Goddamn, took you long enough," he sniffed. Babe couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Waldo curled his arms around both of them, blaster still held in one hand. "All right boys, we can do the reunion once we're out of here," Lieutenant rasped past a lump of his own. "What the hell you got here, Lutz?" He eyed the StarCraft squatting in the middle of the room. "XSJ, Lieutenant," Lutz swiped the tears leaking from his eyes. "That damn lick wanted us to get it started for him." Lieutenant stared at the dark tunnel in the shuttle, debating. He rushed over to the matte black shuttle and circled it. "Could you?" "This guy was working with them on it," Lutz pointed out Johnson. "Collaborator," Babe spit. "Bring him here," Lieutenant said. Waldo jerked the cowering man out of the huddle of prisoners standing aimless as they watched the soldiers in strange suits rescue one of them. "You get this thing to fly?" Johnson shook his head, stringy hair flapping around his thin face. "What's wrong with it?" "If I knew that, I could make it work." "You a rocket scientist?" Johnson shook his head again. "Just unlucky enough to figure things out," he said. Lieutenant eyed the paunch of his stomach, out of place among the emaciated prisoners. "Looks like you figured out something," he sneered. "I am a survivor," Johnson shrugged. "You haven't made it out of here yet," Lieutenant told him and bit back on the pleasure he got watching the man shiver in fear. "All right," Lieutenant turned to Waldo and Babe. "No time to stay here and get it running." "Destroy it?" Waldo asked. He lifted his blaster and sent a shot into the XSJ as Johnson screamed no and dropped to the floor. The beam bounced off the hull and ricocheted into one of the prisoners, splattering him across the floor. "Damn it, Waldo," shouted Lieutenant. "I was aiming for the engine," Waldo pouted. "Was he one of the good ones?" Lieutenant asked Lutz. Lutz shrugged. "Didn't know him. Don't know any of them." "The hull is blast-proof," said Johnson as he climbed off the floor. "You can't destroy it with our weapons." "These things weren't that stable to begin with," said Lutz. "My brother told me they all blew up going into space." "Not all of them," said Babe. "Most of them." "Well, if he can't get this one running, we're not going to leave someone behind who can. You're coming with us." Johnson started to back away. He turned and ran. Lutz lunged after him. "Wait," Lieutenant ordered. "Babe, Waldo, get all them out of here. I'll grab that one." He started after the fleeing man who ran to the far end of the room, trying to keep the shuttle between himself and the man in the suit. Babe and Waldo rounded up the survivors, including Lutz, and led them into the dark tunnel. "Look here, idiot," Lieutenant said as he stalked after the man. "You got 2 choices in this matter. Either I shoot you, or you come with." A hidden doorway opened on the other side of Johnson. "There's a third option," said Jake as he stepped through. He cracked Johnson across the back of the head with the butt of his rifle and kicked the body out of the way, leaving a smear of crimson on the polished concrete floor. "What the fuck are you doing here?" Lieutenant stared at the doorway. "Following orders," said Jake. LIC Commander ducked under the hidden panel and moved into the room. He wore an exoskeleton much like the one Lieutenant wore, designed for his 7-foot frame. Lieutenant didn't bother to nest his rifle. He sent a blast toward the alien and a second toward Jake. The boy was fast and ducked out of the way. The alien not so much. The blast slammed into its chest and sent it sprawling on the floor. Jake ran for the dark tunnel entrance, shooting over his shoulder as he ran. None of the blasts came close, but it forced Lieutenant to duck. Jake hit the dark edge of the tunnel and disappeared after Waldo and Babe. Bonnie jumped up to run after him, and had just enough time to see a blur out of the corner of his eye. LIC Commander slammed into him and pounded him into the wall. Lieutenant slid to the floor. The alien grabbed him by the boot and twirled him across the room. The blaster flew one way, Lieutenant the other. He crashed into the side of the shuttle and slid down. Lieutenant blinked back the shadows, trying to gain his feet to keep the world from going black. An alarm blared inside his helmet, warnings flashing red as the computerized components tried to reroute systems. He glanced around, searching for a weapon as the alien stalked toward him. Chapter 42. Jake ran through the darkness. The heads-up display inside his helmet turned the interior of the tunnel into a tinge of green, but he didn't notice. He only saw the way was clear. His mind was racing as he tried to recall why he was running. Someone had been there. Someone stepped out of the shadows as he guarded the entrance and spoke to him in a hissing robotic voice. He couldn't remember anything else, except to run. They were back there. A platoon of licks or more. They killed Lieutenant and Jake almost didn't make it. He couldn't remember. He only knew he was running, trying to escape. Death chased him in the darkness. He almost shot Babe. The giant was standing in the middle of the tunnel, rifle aimed at Jake as he ran. The young man slid to a stop and almost spilled onto his knees despite the compensators in the suit. "What the hell are you doing here?" Babe screamed. "They got Lieutenant," Jake sobbed. "He sent me to flank and they got him." Babe started to run back up the tunnel, but Jake grabbed him. "There are too many of them," he screamed. He aimed his rifle at the concrete roof of the tunnel and fired a bolt into ceiling. Dust and chunks of debris rained down like a scattering of stone rain. "We have to get him," Babe yelled. "No time," Jake shouted back. "They're coming." He could see them. In his mind, he saw the platoon, moving through the darkness as they threatened to overwhelm him. The alien snouts licking the air, tasting victory. He set a second, then a third blast into the ceiling. Waldo ran to them. "Where's Lieutenant?" he screamed in the noise and confusion. "Dead," Babe said in a flat voice. "Fucking licks killed him." "They're coming," Jake screamed over the whine of his blaster. Babe and Waldo joined him, sending shots of their own into the ceiling. It cracked and crumbled in a cascading avalanche that blocked the way into the warehouse. A plume of dust and smoke chased the trio out of the tunnel and enveloped the entrance. It covered the suits in a layer of grime. Lutz coughed and gagged in the cloud. Babe lifted him up and carried him out. "Lieutenant?" he coughed. But no one could answer him. Chapter 43. "You started all of my trouble," LIC Commander hissed through the voice box attached to his suit. The plodding footsteps echoed on the chamber floor as he stalked toward Lieutenant. Bonnie kept blinking. The suit protected him from most of the blows, and the flight through the air almost would have been fun, except for the landing. The landing hurt. The lick got closer and sent a boot into his helmet. Again, the suit absorbed most of the blow, but something about the physics of the angle cracked his jaw to one side as his head spun around. He crawled across the floor, made it 6 feet before an alien boot cracked into his ribs and sent him into the machine attached to the XSJ. He fumbled off the floor, hands pounding the unseen keys as his gloved fingers fought for purchase. Lieutenant spied his blaster and leapt for it. He wrapped his fingers around the tip of the barrel as the alien grabbed his boot and sent him spinning through the room again. This time he held onto it as he tumbled, flipped through the air and smashed on his back to fetch up against the corner where the wall met the floor. Lieutenant rolled over, lifted the rifle and aimed at the LIC Commander. He squeezed the trigger. The blaster made a pitiful whine that grew in volume. Lieutenant saw the barrel was crimped just as his headset went all red with a critical overload warning. He didn't think, he whipped the blaster at the alien's head, because if it was going to blow, it might as well take an enemy with him. The LIC Commander ducked, his reflexes enhanced by the modified suit he wore as well. The rifle sailed over its head, clattered on the concrete floor and fetched up against the hidden doorway. Lieutenant had enough time to duck, cover his head as the wine reached an ear-splitting pitch and the world around them went supernova in an explosion that turned everything white before it went dark. Stay in the adventure enlargement.